presumably.
Inshallah. Preparing to live stream the meeting. All right.
I have clicked OK. I don't know if I needed to, but I signed my soul away. I signed my soul away to YouTube about 17 years ago now. Seems to have worked out fine.
Okay, all right. It looks like we are rolling.
Cool.
And yeah, let me see if I can pull up the chat where I can see it.
I will do the same.
I'm
Nice.
gonna try and like get it in a particular. There we go. Okay, yeah, people are popping in already. Awesome. I'm just trying to make sure that I can see the chat, but not see the like the YouTube display of us because it's like delayed and that will like make my brain stop working. So hi
Cool.
everybody in the chat. What's up? How you doing? So
I'm gonna go ahead and share this with my
oh
people.
yeah. Let's see. I can at least share it on X. Maybe we can get some more people in here. That would be awesome. And Discord.
Right. Yeah, I'll do the same. Let's see. Let's break some records tonight.
All right, yeah. Okay, well, now that we got that rolling, yeah, so let's see where we want to start. I mean, I know me and you have both been really delving into Steiner lately, so that might be a good place to begin, I suppose. Well, actually, maybe not directly leading into Steiner,
You
but
always got to ease into anthroposophy. There's no good place to start. So,
yeah, it's the all ends of anthroposophy are the deep end. So, um, but yeah, I've been working on I'm doing like a reboot right now of that like really old. Like it was actually the first series of videos I ever did on YouTube where I was going over Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin, right? And so I'm like remastering that into what is very quickly turning into like probably gonna end up being like 4 2-hour long videos. So it's just it's gonna be an absolute monstrosity. But um in the process of doing that, my mind has been all over the place, and part of that is the synergy between Gebser and Steiner. Like, there's so much there that we could talk about. You know, like so Gebser, of course, he's got his different structures of consciousness, right? He's got the archaic and the magical and the mythical and all that. And then you have something very similar in Steiner, where he's got his kind of different epochs of human civilization, where it's like he's got the Indian and then the Egypto-Chaldean, and then I think it's the Greeks after that. And so anyway, he's got this very similar kind of process that seems to follow the same basic pattern overall. And it's a pattern I think we see in a lot of different things. This kind of catabolic descent, and then followed by this kind of turning point, and then you've got this anabolic ascent which follows it. And so I'm looking at these different structures of consciousness and like how like the big picture is here, what's really going on. And one of the conclusions I've been coming to is that the self-conceptualization of human consciousness is really like the engine here. When we really zoom out and look at the big picture, and for me, the big picture is kind of welding Gebser and Steiner's ideas together, but like with the archaic structure, right? Gebser describes this as this state of kind of Neptunian embryonic oneness prior to um, any kind of, let's say, subjectivity or egoity, at least in the more full human sense. And that's actually what I kind of wanted to bring up here is what exactly makes the difference between human subjectivity and the kind of self-awareness that we see in like animals, right? So like dolphins, for example, can recognize themselves in a mirror. Higher primates can do it as well, right? But there's something different, I think, about human self-awareness. And I think that that really actually points us in the direction of what this whole process of the evolution of human consciousness really amounts to. So what I mean by that is what I think is going on here is that when like an animal like a dolphin or a chimpanzee or whatever the case, when they experience their selfhood, they are experiencing it as a purely sensory phenomena, right? So like the dolphin sees itself in the mirror, or even if there is no mirror, it's able to perceive its own body as something that on a kind of sensory level at least is distinct from the world. There's this experience of a boundary, even if it's in the most rudimentary sense of a boundary between where the organism's body ends and the world begins. But then it seems to me that there's this kind of abstraction which occurs, or this ideation, where with human consciousness, even the most rudimentary kind of human consciousness, with like what Gebser would call the magical structure, the human self is regarded as not just equivalent to the bodily sensations of the organism, but rather it becomes kind of ideated. It becomes something where the human being is able to experience its own selfhood as a kind of eternal object, or a Newman, or whatever we want to call that, as a form in itself, which has an a kind of transcendental existence, which is independent of the sensory. And so anyway, I wanted to bring this up with you because I think that if you really take that thought and start unfolding it, which is what I've been trying to do lately while I'm in the process of doing this kind of reworking of the ever-present origin series, what you find is that this seems to happen repeatedly throughout this process. And it's like within the transition from the archaic to the magical, this happens with subjectivity. We ideate subjectivity into a kind of transcendental object that is no longer equivocated with the sensory. But then with the movement from the magical to the mythical, we seem to do the same thing, but with like ideals, with like the fire element. There's this kind of elemental pattern that plays itself out here where um, now within the mythical, there's this kind of division between the terrestrial world and a celestial world, and that's the world of the ideals. And so it's like, as you move through these different consciousness structures, it's like at each stage, we're taking something that was considered sensory, and that we were actually perceiving imminently in the world, and we're kind of moving it over from that domain into the transcendental domain. And so this is where Steiner comes in, because Steiner, he describes this as like, in I forget what he calls it. I guess it would be the Egypto-Chaldean epoch, but either way, for Gebser, it would be like the mythical structure. Human consciousness is actually able to perceive the astral bodies directly away, and then you're just left with the etheric within this the Greco-Roman period for Steiner, but we're left with the capacity to perceive the etheric directly. And then finally, once we get to this kind of Renaissance period, that's that even that is stripped away, and you're left with just like bodily surfaces, basically, as that which is left of the immanent. And so, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that, or I'll just keep rambling. But yeah, hopefully that kind of sketches out the kind of ballpark I'm thinking in. But yeah, I'll pass it back to you now.
Awesome. Great place to start. Yeah, I surprisingly I haven't thought too deeply about the resonances between Gebser and Steiner, but now that you mention it, yeah. And Steiner is mentioned, or at least anthroposophy is mentioned once or twice in Ever Present Origin, right? Like in a footnote, maybe.
Maybe
Um,
in a footnote, he definitely never engages with it at length. He name drops a few people. He mentions Whitehead. He
yep.
mentions Heidegger a bit and Jung, but I don't know. Maybe he does mention Steiner. I don't remember actually. I'd have to look.
I wonder if maybe later I'll grab it. We can actually do some line by
Yeah, we can do
line
some
reading.
research here on live stream. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so Steiner has this sevenfold fractal evolutionary cosmology, and so you've got the seven planetary epochs. We're at number four, the Earth, and then within the Earth, you've got these sort of seven epochs. You know, the Polarian, the Hyperborean, the Lemurian, the Atlantean, and so on. We're in the post-Atlantean, which is the fifth, and there are seven cultural epochs within that. And I think Gebser's story seems to take place within that post-Atlantean epoch, unless you want to say that the archaic sort of includes everything prior. Um,
I've played with the idea that the magical would actually correspond to the Atlantean because and the reason
mm,
I'm saying that is because
yeah.
it seems like that breaking point right there between like the Paleolithic and the Neolithic revolution, that to me seems like the boundary between the
Mm.
magical and the mythical. But anyway, that's a whole rant. We could talk more about that later. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because already with the Neolithic, I feel like there is um, a very early inception of the mental, just this division between nature and the city and the control of the generative process of life through agriculture and the measurement of the land and the as soon as the Neolithic Revolution happens, you've got this society becomes hierarchical. You've got the priests who are also the bankers who are uh, taxing people and making sure that based on the measurements of the farmland that a certain quota is met, a certain level of productivity is met. And so anyways, already with the Neolithic, when you have farming, there's already not only is there this movement to the mythic, but the inception of the mental already is there too. But yeah, that's a huge shift. And I can see why you would say that's the magic to the mythic. Uh,
Well, let me bring up something right here then.
yeah.
Are you familiar with Julian Jaynes, The Birth of Consciousness and the Bicameral Mind? You know what I'm talking
Hmm.
about?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been kind of taking those two things, like the well, this whole like Paleolithic to Neolithic thing, and then you've got James's narrative here, and then you've also got Jasper's narrative about the axial age. And I've been trying to kind of weave these things together, and I think it reveals a pretty clear picture, actually, because with James's narrative, what you have is really the way I see it anyway is the internalization of the I would call it like the dianoetic mind, right? Like the dialogue mind, the inner voice is being internalized into the human ego, such that we're actually experiencing that dialogue as something that our individual locus of agency is actually doing rather than something that is happening to us, right? And so I think this is another clue here, right? Because if we contextualize that within this broader process of like these different layers of reality effectively being kind of stripped away from the immanent and being put in the transcendental realm. Like what's happening in that process is that those are like powers that are being granted to the human ego in a sense, right? So even with like the subjectivity with the birth of the magical structure, you could think of archaic consciousness as kind of swimming in this ocean of I amness. And then when it becomes ideated, rendered as a kind of transcendental object, there's also an internalization that's happening here as well, where now it's like the human consciousness is kind of like this. You could almost think of it as like a conduit of sorts between the transcendental and the immanent. And so over time, it's like as this process is unfolding, the human ego is getting kind of bigger and bigger, and but then the world is getting like thinner and thinner because we're our there are more layers of the world that are no longer being seen as just strictly immanent and sensory.
Mm. Yeah, and I love the image of the human being as a cosmic conduit, linking the immanent and the transcendent, or the spiritual and the material. Um,
Mm.
when I thought about talking to you, I was thinking of topics and titles, and like anthropocosmic immediately came to mind, and so I'm not
Oh
surprised that we're
yeah.
here. And both Gebser and Steiner are anthropocosmic thinkers, which means to understand the universe, you have to understand the human being, um, and the human being's evolution, which is no different than the evolution of the cosmos. And so that's what we're talking about here is these the spiral of time. I was going to say cycles of time, but it does seem to be going somewhere. Um, and yeah, Julian Jaynes is like one of the OG hemisphere uh, hypothesis thinkers who, I mean, part of his idea, right, was that the hemispheres were actually not as integrated in the sort of mythic uh, cultural periods, and so that we heard voices in our heads and thought they were gods when actually, I mean, I shouldn't say actually, but in a later phase of evolution, we identified with those voices and said, "Oh no, that's me." Um, and so that process of internalization that you're describing is part of what's going on, or process of incarnation, you could say, is part of what's going on in human evolution. And you were talking about animals earlier. What differentiates the human form of self-consciousness from animal sentience, consciousness? And Steiner talks about animals having group souls, and um, that they're it's not that there's not an I or an ego associated with the animal realm or with individual members of whatever species. But that I is outside of the organism. It exists in the cosmos at large. And so you were saying it's as if animals through their sensory experience encounter the ego rather than with human beings. It's like, no, that ego is it's the synesthetic transcendental unity behind those sensory experiences. It's like what um, we identify with as having those sensory experiences, whereas animals are almost receiving it from the outside. Um, but in this
Yeah, this
anthropocosmic, yeah, yeah, go
kind
ahead.
of brings up another thing that I was thinking about, which is like what I, this line of thinking to me, it starts to really almost blur the boundary between like the sensory and like ideational perception in a way. It makes it look like, even in Whitehead, you do have a pretty clear distinction between like physical prehensions and conceptual prehensions. But if we look at this narrative, what it starts to look like is that there this is not just a hard line exactly. Like somehow it is kind of a permeable barrier in a way, because it's like when an animal, for example, perceives its own selfhood. Like that is in a sense a kind of conceptual prehension, as an experience of a kind of form, certainly. But then you can have this other thing that happens almost where that form can be perceived as something independent of its embodied manifestation or independent of its contents in a way. Bergson has this interesting thing that he says at one point. He says that human subjectivity is more than something. And so he's saying that subjectivity is always this extra thing that's more than the contents of experience. And then you've got like Zizek on the other side of that, who says that our subjectivity is less than nothing. But they seem to be saying fairly similar things here, that there's this weird lack, as it were, within subjectivity, because it's never going to be just an object exactly. But then on the other side of that, you've got this process where it seems like, at one point, if we're believing Steiner's narrative, and Gebser seems to say this as well, that within previous epochs of human history, we were able to perceive in a sensorial way the astral body, the etheric body, for example, which would imply that these aren't, how do I want to say this? It implies that maybe I could say it like this, that when these forms become embodied, they are available to the senses, but perhaps it's like, are we conceptually prehending something in the past, which is kind of what Whitehead would describe as hybrid prehension, or what exactly? It seems to me like maybe if we really like dug into this, I think, and this is just kind of an intuition away because I haven't really fleshed this out, but if we really dug into this, I think we would find that within Whitehead's language, even physical prehensions are a kind of hybrid prehension. It's
Of
just that.
God. But yeah, of God's primordial nature. That's what he says, that the physical pole is actually always a hybrid prehension that includes the entire past and the primordial nature of God.
Okay. Okay. Well, all
Yeah.
right. Whitehead beat me to the punch as usual, but yeah, I mean, so anyway, yeah,
Nobody has any idea
what,
what that means, but that's what Whitehead says. Yeah.
well, hopefully a few of the people in our audience have seen at least a few of our videos, and maybe at least know some of the Whitehead lingo.
Yeah.
But
But I mean, what you're saying about ideas and the extent to which we can perceive them, or the extent to which concepts are, I mean, you have two schools of thought in the history of philosophy on this question. The empiricists who say ideas are faded impressions, and so they're kind of reducing it to the sensory. And then you have the the rationalists or the idealists who are saying that no, ideas are real and they're not just faded sensory impressions. Actually, sensory impressions are distorted ideas, or confused perceptions. That's what Leibniz would say. The sensory world is confused, whereas the world of ideas is clear, is ordered. And so um, I think both of us probably tend to side more with the idealist perspective on the question, but at the same time, we both want to make some sense of the fact that we live in this particular moment of history when the vast majority of educated people believe what the empiricists are saying and think that intelligence is something a computer can have, and consciousness is eventually something that a machine can realize, and that ideas are not something transphysical. They're just abstractions. They're just words, you know. And so, to take seriously someone like Steiner or even Plato or any of the idealist philosophers would require, I mean, it's at this particular moment in history, and maybe it's beginning to shift, but it seems like a pretty intense form of resistance to the dominant culture to think that ideas are real, right? And I think there's like a halfway move that people make um, through a kind of, I don't know what to call it other than like computational mysticism, where or kind of information ontology, where they'll start to move in the direction of thinking ideas are real. But the problem there is it doesn't allow you to take that further step, which is it's not just that ideas are real, it's that ideas are, yeah, a layer deeper into the nature of reality than sensations. But there's another layer behind the ideas, and that is spiritual beings are communicating with those ideas. So it's not just that reality is made of forms, it's that reality is made of beings, and ideas are their uh, means of communication to us. And so, you talked about evolution in terms of catabolic and anabolic processes, a process of uh, involution and evolution, or falling into time and then um, returning to eternity. And I think it's important that we acknowledge and do justice to this materialistic moment that we inhabit uh, culturally, um, and not think of it as just simply wrong, but that the ideas and the form of spirituality that you and I are talking about tonight and all the time um, are not meant to. I mean, what I think we don't want to do is say that the form of consciousness that's been won by this process of evolution that has led to the materialistic moment is simply a wrong turn. It had to happen this way. We had to move from archaic to magic to mythic to mental. There's a certain um, structure to the evolutionary process that required this. Um, and so, I think, yeah, I'll try to phrase this as a question to throw it back to you, but like when you relate to um, our cultural environment right now, which is not just full of materialistic, consumerist um, values, but also a lot of people aren't happy. Like you would think, oh, we pursue materialism and consumerism because it brings pleasure, it brings happiness or whatever, but it's not even it's not even bringing anything beneficial to people anymore. And so like there's an opportunity right now, and I wonder, you produce so much content now that's really taking people for a ride uh, there and back again, into these transcendental realms. But like just like I am doing, we're putting this content out on YouTube, on the internet, and like, yeah, people go on this ride, they have these insights, and then they come back and realize that they're still sitting in front of their computer screens, they're lonely, they hate their job. Uh, we're on the verge of World War III. So like, what what are we really trying to do here in this moment? What's your deeper motivation here in producing the content that you do?
Well, all right. Okay,
I'm trying to make it more personal here. I mean, we've
yeah,
been
okay, all
drifting
right.
around in all the
So
big ideas, but like you and I think we both have a sense of mission. Like we want these ideas to matter in some sense. And so how do we speak to our
absolutely,
moment?
yeah. I think that really just brings us to the question of okay, so once the spell is kind of broken, now what, right? Like, I've actually, I was watching some stuff on this guy. His name was, what was it? Seraphim Rose. He was actually a student of Alan Watts,
Hmm.
and he ended up kind of becoming disillusioned with Watts's more Eastern New Agey thing, and so he ended up converting to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and he took this extremely radical kind of attitude towards it. He went out, basically built a cabin in the woods, and stayed out there and wrote and wrote and wrote and died. And so I was just watching a documentary about this, and it kind of got me thinking along these lines of like, okay, well, what do you do with all this? And I remember thinking, that is not what you do.
Hmm.
I certainly do not think that the answer is just this complete disavowal of the world and retreating into a cabin in the woods to go be a monk and whatnot. Because, and hey, I mean, I'll leave room for the possibility that retreating for the world from the world could be good for certain people, on whatever kind of path they happen to be on. But
But he was writing at least, right? I mean, he was communicating, even if the writing is sitting, on some shelf somewhere, and most of it's, I don't know, is it available online? I'm not sure, but nobody reads anymore, so even if it was, it's basically lost to time. But he was at least trying to communicate from his cabin in the woods. He didn't have
right.
YouTube yet.
Well, yeah, and I mean he is pretty popular within certain corners of the internet, but and so yeah, I mean he wasn't just completely rejecting everybody, but at the same time, it seems to me what he was trying to communicate with people, and I'm not as familiar with his writings as other.
You froze on my end, Keelan. Not sure how you're coming through. It looks like you're still going on YouTube. Nope, you're frozen on YouTube too. Well, yeah, I had not heard of Serafina Watts, but uh looks like, wow, daughter of the late Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts, and his wife Shirley. Hmm. Well, we've lost Keelan, so I'm gonna take us on a little learning tour into Serafina Watts here. Um, hmm. Well, I don't know enough about her to speak to her, so Keelan will come back and tell us about her. But yeah, I mean, I was hoping to shift the conversation toward the personal, because I feel like we can go super transpersonal um, so easily. I mean, me and Keelan, and people like us, and yet where this stuff really comes home and the rubber meets the road is at the personal level. And I've been thinking a lot about why I I do this. Um, I mean, I'm a teacher, and I do that academic thing, but I also have this desire to communicate beyond just, what I do for a living. Or what I do for a career. Like, it's in some sense that this is what I do for a living, in the sense that I live to explore these ideas. And as I don't know how long I'm going to live, but get towards the second half of life, I start to ask these questions more about why I am doing what I'm doing. Looks like Keelan's back. It's been the Matt Siegel show for a few minutes, Keelan, but we missed you. I was just about to get all sentimental, so it's a good thing you showed up. Just reading some of the comments here. Forget where you are, Keelan. You're somewhere in the South. And where are you, Keelan? Are you in Louisiana? No, I still don't have audio from you. Is that my fault? Can anyone else hear Keelan? Because I can't hear Keelan.
Okay, am I audible now? There.
There, there you
All
are.
righty. Okay. Yeah, no, I was
Welcome
saying
back.
that I do live in the South, but I am in Huntsville, Alabama, which means
Alabama.
Alabama. Yep. And I live in the middle of the city, so my internet has absolutely no business bugging out like this. But apparently, it decided to at just the right time. So, okay, yeah. So anyway, what I was getting at there was that, yeah, I don't think the answer is a cabin in the woods, but at the same time, it's like, we can envision a better society, and I think we should be doing that. But um, I do think that maybe at this point in time, the it's like, I've seen people talk about these ideas of like starting intentional communities and things like that. And I don't hate that idea by any means, but at the same time, I'm not sure if we're quite ready for that yet. I feel like there's a kind of groundwork that needs to be laid in order to really make that possible, in terms of our understanding of the world, and also the kind of agency that we need to be able to develop in order to really um, envision and enact some kind of alternative to modernity. So I, for one, am not necessarily in a rush to go and build some kind of community out in the middle of nowhere in South America or what have you. But I don't know. I At the same time, I feel like I'm laying the groundwork for something, and I feel like the answer is never going to be trying to fix modernity through electoral politics or some kind of glorious revolution or whatever the case may be. I kind of do feel like ultimately the answer is going to have to be, like I said, trying to envision a new society that can exist alongside or somehow within
Yeah.
Ahriman, as it were. So,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Armand's coming. Yeah, it's
Oh, yeah.
interesting that you go there because I used to, I don't know, in my 20s think about, gosh, the only future like material future that I would want to imagine would be like, yeah, find a group of close friends and like start some kind of intentional community commune thing and return to the land and like um but I'm not opposed to that, but it seems like I like this idea that like Hegel and Schelling used to talk about the invisible college. Like, yes, we're seeking a kind of ideal community, but it's not necessarily going to be a community in the immediate present or in the near future. We could be striving for a kind of community in the far future. And I don't just mean like 50 years from now. I mean like a form, it could be that we need to evolve a form of consciousness that's going to take, another million years before we can actually live in community.
And I
Um,
also think there is value in sticking with it, and just kind of being in this, because like if you're off in a cabin in the woods, or if it's an intentional community of like 150 people or whatever,
yeah,
one thing you're not doing is you're not changing the way people within modernity are thinking about these things, the way that they're perceiving reality. I mean, I would much rather be here making my stupid YouTube videos and giving people a sense of hope than out, in the Ozarks trying to start some kind of community, because I just don't feel like we're quite ready for that yet. I feel like the thing to do right now is to be in it and to deal with the evil and the Ahriman and the social media and all this other
yeah,
madness. Because as horrific as it may be in certain ways, it is happening for a reason. I believe we're supposed to come out on the other side of this and be something different. We're supposed to go through this, and so yeah, I just don't. I feel like maybe at some point the answer would be to say, okay, we're done with this. Let's try something different. But yeah, I don't think we're quite there yet.
yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. It's gonna get worse before it gets better.
Mm-hmm.
And um we're I mean it's part of why I feel like as much as both of us want to resist the um, bad metaphysics of materialism, um, we're also just that's the ocean we swim in. And um, there's no way to deny the situation we find ourselves in, which we're gonna very quickly in the next probably in our lifetimes have a situation where there's a real like speciation event where
Mm.
people are going to be like the next version of the iPhone in terms of like the communications revolution, new technology that changes everything. There's a before and after is going to be an implant of some kind. It's going to be like a kind of uh, nervous system interface that's, yeah, it's just another step along the path we've already been on, but at the same time, it's going to cross the skin boundary in some sense. And so what's artificial and what's natural is going to break down. So the transhuman revolution is upon us or going to happen, and we have to contend with that. If we are spiritual, or I'll just use that word, and we can talk about what it means. Then, uh, for whatever our reasons are, we're going to want to say, there's something important about what the human being is that gets diminished and shrunken, um, and goes off track if it fully embraces this mechanization of not just of nature, but of the human as well. And there's something to be communed with and um, something to be learned from that would be beyond what can be programmed or reduced to an algorithm. And that the only way we can relate to that is not going to be through our calculative intellect, our mechanistic mind, but through a form of, well, various other organs of perception like imagination, inspiration, intuition. And very few of us have been educated or enculturated in such a way that we take inspiration, intuition, imagination seriously as ways of knowing that
Mm.
are just as important as intellect. And I mean, even intellect is relatively rare, at least in the United States. I don't know where, in terms of the, reading comprehension and basic education, the U.S. is like not doing very well compared to other democracies, so-called. Um, but in order to resist this transhumanist technologization of everything, we need to take serious, not just take seriously as in like, oh, I believe in the power of imagination. No, like actually cultivate it. Begin to see imaginatively. Begin to cultivate relationships, not just to ideas, but to the beings who communicate those ideas from non-physical realms. Like actually begin to be able to communicate so that you're not just, this isn't just about a wish or a hope that these sorts of things are real. It's like, if we're going to head off this harmonic uh, diversion of the flow of human evolution, we're going to need more than just belief. It's not that we need a new religion or a new ideology. It's like we need a new way of seeing. And I feel like I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like a lot of your work is an attempt to help people see in a different way, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said about like the imagination, the intuition, inspiration as ways of knowing. This is one point I've been trying to kind of hammer home lately. I haven't gotten to the point of dividing up imagination, intuition, and inspiration in the way that Steiner does. So I've just been using imaginal as this kind of catch-all, the way that Barfield does. But I've been saying a lot lately that what's really important here is seeing the imagination as an epistemological faculty, and seeing empathy as an epistemological faculty. And I think those two things are very closely related. Our
Mm.
ability to perceived in an imaginal way is perceiving into things. Like the way, I love the way that Gebser talks about this. He says that within that kind of integral vision, awareing, he says, we render the world transparent. We see the diaphaneity of the world, and so there's this seeing into the depths of things, and with empathy, with an ability to actually experience what other people are experiencing. I mean, that's what that is. We're actually perceiving the inner worlds of our fellow beings. And so there's a connection here. It's you have the metaphysical, which becomes the epistemological, which then becomes the moral and the social, and bleeds into these questions about what to do with that. But I wanted to bring up another thing here, since we're talking about this. You mentioned America, and I think it's interesting to think about this in terms of how we are situated in this whole narrative as Americans. And so I hear a lot of people lately saying that, like, we're at the downfall of the American empire, and that, like, I hear this all the time, this comparison made that, like, that we are in this phase of American civilization that is equivalent to the late period of the Roman Empire before it finally collapsed during what would that be, the 5th century AD. And what's interesting here is, so if you look at Oswald Spengler, what he says about this, and what's interesting is that Steiner says actually something very similar, and so does Carl Jung, actually. Spengler says that American civilization is actually still embryonic. It is still in a state of pseudomorphosis, because it is in this state where there is a kind of foreign form language, as he calls it, which is kind of imposing itself upon the geography, upon the people. And because of that superposition of that non-native form language, there's an inability of the native civilization to actually fully germinate, right? And so Spengler says this about Russia as well, that Russia for a very long time was in this perpetual state of pseudomorphosis, and you can see it. You can see the way that, going all the way back even to Catherine the Great, she was German. Peter the Great was obsessed with German culture. During the Soviet period, and even before that, you had this tendency that goes back hundreds of years for the intelligentsia of Russia to be obsessed with Britain and Germany, and seeing their own land and their own people as these, backwards hillbillies that need to be civilized by bringing in all this Germanic and British stuff. So that Peter the Great, for example, was obsessed with creating a navy, because he was obsessed with the British Navy. He forced all of the people within his royal court to shave off their traditional beards, and they had to wear blue because that was Prussian. And so anyway, and you can see in people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, both of whom are two really core figures in the Russian sense of self-identity itself, I would say. Both of these guys were figures who identified with that kind of intelligentsia and eventually rejected it. Within Tolstoy's Confessions, I mean, that's exactly what's going on. He's rejecting that rejection of Russia, and he's returning to the land. He's returning to Orthodox Christendom. He's disavowing this kind of cerebral disavowal of ordinary human life. And you see the exact same thing within Dostoevsky, within Notes from the Underground. That's exactly what Dostoevsky's doing. He's painting this picture of the Russian intellectual as this kind of resentment-fueled, arrogant, person who thinks that they can just use their intellects to completely remake the world, and then it would be a better place. And crime and punishment is really just a more developed form of that. And so anyway, I think we're entering a period right now, perhaps, within which, now that Marxism has kind of been shrugged off, that there's a possibility, latent at least, for a truly Russian culture to really germinate for the first time. And so anyway, so Spengler says that about Russia, but he also says that about the United States. And so if we look at what Spengler calls Faustian civilization, which that corresponds more or less to what we would typically call Western European civilization, Promethean civilization. That's a term that gets used sometimes. You
Modern
have these.
specifically, right? Like modern Western. Is that what he means by Faustian? More the modern, or yeah?
Yeah. So Faustian for Spengler, I believe it begins with what time period? It begins during the Middle Ages for sure. But it's basically Western European civilization, and so you could say, yeah, it's modern. But Spengler is saying that American civilization in itself is not Faustian civilization. It's in a state of pseudomorphosis, because Faustian civilization is kind of imposed upon it from without. And Faustian civilization, its core motif seems to be something like the spire, right? So if you go back to the Middle Ages, you have these like Gothic cathedrals where the centerpiece is this central spire. And then, so of course, within that context, this is a reference to the ideal of Christ as kind of a central telos, through which the society can kind of orient itself around that one central axis. But then you see this motif, the spire, kind of transform over time. You see it as the Eiffel Tower, and as the Big Ben as well. And so within the Eiffel Tower and within Big Ben, you have the same core motif, but now there's something technological about it. There's this idea of technology as standing over and above the civilization and imposing a kind of order upon it. And so you can see that as a kind of mutation of that, the spire that we see in the Gothic cathedral. And so then you jump over to America, and you have that same motif now as the skyscraper, where now it's performing a similar function as a symbol, but now it's gesturing towards this idea of like the American self-made man and entrepreneurship and capitalism and that kind of thing. And so if we look at this through a kind of Spenglerian lens, which is really a Goethean lens, I believe, because Spengler is really developing his whole idea of the morphology of civilizations in a way that's based upon Goethe's metamorphosis of plants. But anyway, we can see that skyscraper and also like the Saturn V rockets and Elon Musk's rockets and whatnot as being this pseudomorphic imposition from Faustian civilization, which is kind of like this concrete that has been painted over what will eventually become a truly American civilization. And so I promise I'm finally getting to my point now. That then raises the question of what the core symbol of American civilization would actually be, and how it might differentiate itself from Faustian civilization. And the answer that I've come up for that is that it's actually the Thunderbird. It's the eagle. It's why we're so obsessed with planes. The Wright brothers. There's this motif of the bird there, and this goes all the way back to Native American mythology as well. This idea of the Thunderbird as being their equivalent of like Zeus or Jupiter or what have you. And so anyway, I guess I'll leave it at that. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because it makes me wonder, like, if American civilization has a central role to play in this narrative, at least during one phase of the narrative, then what will that role be? I don't think it's the American Empire. I think it's something else that hasn't happened yet. And so I've just been kind of meditating upon this idea of the Thunderbird and what that could mean for our ideas about freedom and the relationship between the earth and the transcendental and the bird as something kind of mediating between the two. Think of the space shuttle, for example. Actually, the space shuttle, okay, I promise I'll shut up after this, but I love the space shuttle because it's such a perfect embodiment of these dynamics, because you have the Faustian spire as the booster rockets, which is lifting the bird up to the transcendental realm because it can't spread its wings yet. The shuttle has these nubby little wings, it can't fly on its own. And so it's kind of hijacking the ascent of Faustian civilization to get airborne. So anyway, yeah, I've really been thinking a lot about how that might continue to play itself out. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you.
Sorry, I was muted. I love we're talking about America, that we're talking about America right now because it's yeah, we're going through our Pluto return.
Mm,
We're dying. That's
yeah.
Pluto, it's like, I don't know, 230 something years to go all the way back around to where it was when the country was born, when the Constitution was signed. And that's a death rebirth process. And I was thinking, I love everything you're saying, and it lines up well with Steiner's sense of the way that the cultural epochs unfold. Like actually, when we finish the current Anglo-Germanic epoch, which is he says supposed to go on to like 3,500, 3,000, the year 3,500 or so. But I think maybe things are speeding up. I always feel like things are speeding up, but that could be my own subjective perception just getting older. But after that comes the Slavic epoch, the Russian epoch, basically.
Mm.
And that's not, yeah, that would be still 1,500 years from now, basically. And you look at current events and we get so tied up in our single lifetimes as human beings. And that's the thing about being a self-conscious human being and not just an animal, like, where we started this conversation, we have an I. That means we reincarnate.
Mm.
If we're more than our bodies, we reincarnate. And so even though, we're thinking about transformations that have happened in the 20th and 21st centuries that are really just premonitions of what will occur in the material and political reality of our shared world 1,500 years from now, you know? And we have such a truncated vision of time because we're so body bound. We're so materialistic. We're so enclosed into our little sensory containers that we forget that no, actually, we will be here again, uh, 2,000 years from now, reincarnated and living in a different cultural epoch. And so the Slavics will and the Russians will have their time in a few thousand years. Putin's trying to rush it right now. And geopolitics as we see it today is from Steiner's point of view, impossible for us to mm, shift or uh, have an effect on as individuals. Geopolitics right now, like Steiner says, like these are archangelic battles taking place, and we're not. We might be the most like full of such brotherly love for international peace and whatever, uh, but that's actually just our own very subjective sentiment that has nothing to do with the actual forces that are at play causing these wars to happen. Um, and so it's at such a deep unconscious level that this power is playing out that we need to get real and see and think again in terms of multiple lifetimes and in terms of the unfolding of cultural epochs where like yeah for now NATO is large and in charge and like the Anglo American civilization seems to be in power, and everybody wants to hate on the colonial imposition, that has resulted on this particular culture having dominance over the planet. But the thing is, like, if you go back in time, before us, it was Rome, it was Greece, it was Persia, it was Egypt, it was ancient India, and there's always been in the history of this human species and this post-Atlantean epoch, at least, a particular culture that has incarnated the world spirit more intensely. While there were other people spread over the rest of the planet, there was a particular cultural center from which, like, the mana was being dispensed. And it's only a matter of time before America does collapse. But the thing is, we may have a American civilization, the United States is moving into a dark age, perhaps. But the thing is that after the Slavic epoch, Steiner says around 5700 CE, then there's the American epoch. Actually, that's the prime of what we
Mhm.
think of today as the United States of America. And maybe at that point, like, Canada will be the 51st state. Like, who knows? Um, but you mentioned that the Thunderbird, and maybe you know this already, but Grandpa Joe just made the bald eagle the national bird. That's one of Biden's, like, parting gifts to the country, is to finally make that official. So that's big.
Interesting. I didn't realize that wasn't official, but okay.
It's now officially part of the myth of and the symbolism of this country, that the bald eagle is it's who we are, at this deep level. Um, and I think that there is something about the eagle that I think, you know, I get what you're saying about Faustian civilization, and how the United States and Spengler's way of thinking about it is not fully Faustian, but there's something resisting that. But the eagle does have this sense of intellectualism about it. It's like the eye that's got the overhead view, um, scanning the whole field and is able to see everything that's going on. The all-seeing eye, right? Um,
Eagle also kind of gestures towards Prussia as well. That was a major symbol for the Germanic peoples. So yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's interesting to think about that. I mean, we might not be fully Faustian, but undoubtedly there's some cross pollination for sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, America's always been about um, a sense of, like, seeking home. I mean, a nation of immigrants, right? People came here because where they were, it was not going well for them. They were refugees. America's always been a place for refugees. I mean, also slaves, and there were indigenous people here. And so it's like this intense intersection of uh, trauma that creates this country. The trauma of the whole world creates this country. I mean, all of human history is a process of migration and displacement and climate change. Long before the current climate change, there were other forms of climate. I mean, the Neolithic Revolution happens because the last ice age ends, and we enter in this interglacial period called the Holocene. Climate change created human civilization. So maybe climate change will also end this particular iteration of human civilization, but um, we've always been subject to the Earth's larger patterns here. Um, but yeah, where was I going with that? I mean, civilization is a very tenuous project, and I think I think we just need to take a longer uh, view of it, a longer term view of it, and Spengler's very good at that. And okay, yeah, yeah, this is what I wanted to say about America being Faustian. Uh, there is something populist about us. I mean, there's
Mhm.
something, it's like the people and this anti-elitist, like, sense of common sense values that we really, want to emphasize. That's very much having a moment right now, which is part of the Pluto return. It's like the masses, the poor and working people are like, fuck this raw deal. Like, we're not. we're not taking it anymore. And that's, you know, I feel split right down the middle. I am so American. I love this country so much. But I'm both like, you know, my mom's from Ohio and my dad's, you know, and my mom's family has been in this country since the late 1600s, coming from Northwest Europe, and my dad's parents are Ashkenazi Jews, first generation. New York City came over from Romania in the 20s. And I'm like that, like Jewish intellectualism and, you know, homegrown American folksy, uh, you know, sort of way of being. And it really, it really pains me to see the country at war with itself like this right now. But it also feels so uh, potent. We're in such a transformative moment. Um, it's a powder keg, and like there have been several times in the last couple of years where I thought, oh my God, it's gonna blow up right now. And it kind of did, but it didn't fully, like not to the level of 1860. But we're like, I can't help but feel like we're just inching closer to that conflagration. But this country is so creative in its destruction, if I can put it that way. And so I'm terrified and excited about it at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, and looking at these, you mentioned the Pluto return. We're also coming up on, I believe, this summer will be the Uranus return as well, happening at the same time as the Pluto return, and that's something that I've really been looking at, and thinking about, like what that could mean. Have you heard of the book, the Fourth Turning?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Who's the author of that again?
I one guy's name, his last name was Howe. I forget the other guy's name. Um, but yeah, it's like a work of theoretical history, basically,
William
and it
Strauss and Neil Howe. Okay.
yeah. And so it conjectures this cyclical pattern of turnings where these occur in generational cycles of about 80 years. And basically the authors point to this pattern that you can see going all the way back to the birth of the United States in the late 18th century. And so we're at the fourth turning right now, and each turning is made up of these 20-year sacula, I believe is what the term that's used for in the book. And these have their own kind of character. It's very similar to the way that Spengler is kind of taking this idea of a life cycle in terms of like spring, summer, fall, winter. So it's like that, but then compressed down
Hmm.
into these 80-year periods. And these 80-year periods and the events that are significant with them as the major turning points, these correspond to the Uranus return of the United States. Uranus coming back around to Gemini. And yeah, there's a really great episode of the astrology podcast where they talk about this at length, the Uranus return of the United States and how it corresponds with all these major events throughout United States history. And what it typically corresponds to is an extremely cataclysmic war. Every other time it's been that. And here we are coming up on Uranus coming back with Pluto back in Aquarius. So that's potentially kind of alarming.
Hmm.
But it looks like whatever this is moving towards, it feels like it feels like like constructive interference between two giant waves, right? So you've got the Pluto cycle, Pluto and Aquarius, which is these roughly 250-year periods. The last one was the late 18th century, in which basically everything we associate with modernity came into being: the birth of electrical technology, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. Kant's critique of pure reason. I mean, all of these things were happening in that late 18th century period. And we rewind another 250 years, and then we find ourselves back in the Renaissance, which is equally pivotal, I would say, for all kinds of reasons. And you keep going back, and you see these major transformations that are happening within these 250-year periods, where Pluto's coming back in Aquarius and it's activating something apparently. And then you've got the Uranus period, which is happening kind of nested within that. And so it's like we're within the fourth saculum of the fourth turning of the fourth mega turning, as it were. And so, yeah, it just feels like there's all kinds of things that are really conflagrating and conjugating at the same time here. And yeah, it's exciting, but it's also terrifying. And it really makes me wonder, Joe Biden declaring the balding eagle as the official
The
whatever,
balding evil eagle.
the balding
Like
eagle. I mean, that might seem really goofy, but even the goofiest things maybe have this quality to them where they fit into this bigger picture. Maybe that is the foreshadowing of something, some kind of at least minor awakening of some kind of American consciousness. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at Strauss and Howe's book here, The Fourth Turning, and how they talk about the last few generations. Um, the prophets, which are the boomers, which were born after a crisis during a high. The nomads, or Gen X, which are born during an awakening. The heroes, or the millennials, born during an unraveling. And the artists, or Gen Z, born during a crisis. Um, how old are you, Keelan? Are you Gen Z or millennial?
I'm a millennial. I'm
You're a
32.
millennial. Okay, cool.
Yeah, this is the
Gotcha.
thing about how about Strauss and Howe's book is that they're not looking at it astrologically, right? And
Sure.
so they're trying to do it in these more or less nice, neat little time periods where it's like exactly 80 years and exactly 20 years. And so the argument they make is that the crisis period, we've already been in it since, I believe, like the 2008 financial collapse or something like that.
Yeah, that's when they
But
started.
if you look at it astrologically instead, then they're missing some years every single cycle, basically. And the real
Mhm.
crisis period, I think, has not started yet. It will start, presume if this plays out the way it has historically, it'll start this summer. Which it would be lovely if I was wrong about that, but
Fun.
but
Hmm.
yeah, it seems like even if it isn't some kind of giant cataclysmic war or whatever, it feels like some kind of confrontation with our identity as Americans. That is what's going to be on the table no matter what, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's kind of personal for me, not just because of what I said earlier about feeling so connected to this country and like really wanting to um I mean having no choice, but also really wanting to honor its tragic gifts, and just like be an American. And take on that burden and make the best of it. But just as the country is going through its Pluto return and with Uranus in there and Pluto going into Aquarius, I'm having Pluto go over my sun. And my
Mm.
whole I have a Sun Mercury Venus conjunction, and Pluto is going to go over it over the next several years. And so I'll be going through what the country is going through. So it's especially personal for me right now.
Yeah,
And
yeah, absolutely.
but I feel like this whole conflict, this tension between intellectualism and a sense of organic, vital, um, connection to reality is is so important because we don't want to lose the scientific attitude,
Mm.
right? We want to be scientific in our spirituality. Um, and I wanted to shift the conversation in a somewhat more personal direction by asking the questions I was earlier, but I think it's also important to uh, find ways of speaking that are scientific or universal, and often the personal is, but still like to make sure that we're not ever becoming too sentimental or um, too mm, caught up in our own feeling life and our own antipathies and sympathies and not seeing from the eagle's point of view, right?
Mm.
Um, and so intellectualism can be a boogeyman, but it can also, like, we need nous, we need the conceptual mind to help us bring clarity to confused perceptions. And um, and so, I know you value the conceptual mind. I mean, I know you value science, and you've been in dialogue with scientists over the last year. I think you spoke to Rupert Sheldrake earlier this year, right?
Mm.
Um, and he's a biologist who I think is seeing the living world in an imaginative way and not just in a merely intellectual or mechanical way.
Yeah, and
And
Alex Gomez as well. Me and him chat
Alex, yeah.
all the time. Yeah,
Oh,
he's
good.
great as well. But yeah, about this intellectualism thing. Yeah, this is actually something I was going to bring up a minute ago, because I was thinking about like the American the idea of the American intellectual is an interesting topic in itself, right? Because I'm thinking of like Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman, right? Like it was really after World War II. I mean, you had Thomas Edison before that, but I think it was really after World War II that America as a whole kind of reoriented itself towards the whole idea of science. Because prior to that, you did have this kind of rugged, down to the earth, cowboy type of attitude that didn't have time for all that philosophical nonsense. Which we see ironically juxtaposed in William James, who managed to be both somehow. But that's what I'm getting at here is that, and with Feynman too. Feynman was a guy who was nobody. He was the son of like some kind of salesman, I believe, is what his dad was, and then his mother was just like a stay-at-home mom. Like these were just completely ordinary people, and Feynman, was able to make himself into a kind of intellectual who was able to be taken seriously, but at the same time was able to speak in a way that took away the kind of prudishness and the kind of ivory tower idea of intellectualism. Feynman was able to kind of strip that away, but unfortunately, I feel like that was kind of stillborn in Feynman. I talked about Feynman extensively in some of my videos where I talked about the history of physics, where Feynman, despite being such an emblem of what an American intellectual can be, at the same time, he was also at the forefront of this kind of disavowal of the genuine pursuit of truth within physics. Feynman, he didn't say this, I don't think. This was, but this idea of like shut up and calculate,
That's his
is an
basic
idea
attitude, yeah. He's
that
like,
was his
we can't understand nature, is his attitude, basically. It's
right,
just
exactly.
absurd. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was like, you can see there's this interview where he's being asked about magnetism, and you can see him get like visibly kind of angry and frustrated at the question. He's just like, there's nothing I can compare it to. I can just tell you how it works. And his attitude was just like, that's all we got. That's all we can do. We have the equations. They help us do things. Any other questions you got beyond that, take them to the philosophers. Who cares? We're here to
The
do
Yeah.
And so it
The
was that kind of
refusal is the refusal to analogize. I feel like a lot of scientific materialists refuse to analogize. And Feynman is such a creative genius, but
yeah.
he's still stuck in this materialist view. And the refusal to analogize is like he won't acknowledge that magnetism, for example, if you just let your imagination have this just a little like free reign to make a connection, the obvious connection, it's like, wow, that's a lot. This whole idea of fields, it's a lot like these subjective mental sorts of characteristics of like, being together or like feeling together. The idea of like sharing a vibe, like it's so easy to make those analogies, but there's something about this materialistic posture that's like, oh no, that feels too good. That's too touchy-feely or something. We can't possibly acknowledge that. We have to stick with this form of I mean, you said it was stillborn. It's like there's still this residue of intellectualism that says the truth has to be painful. The truth has to be
Mm.
dry. The truth has to make me remove me from
Because
my
we're terrified of letting our fantasies carry us away. I see this so often with people who have this more kind of materialistic bent. I see this pattern repeat over and over and over again, where these people will be really just wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, just absolutely in love with some idea of transcendence, whether it's just kind of a naive religiosity, well, naive, but non-intellectualized religiosity, let's say. And at a certain point along the way, they end up encountering something where they feel betrayed. They not just betrayed by spirituality, but by their own psyche, in a way, that there was a part of them that compelled them towards whatever the thing was, and it turns out they got duped. And so they feel angry, they feel betrayed, they feel like, how could I have, believed in such silly, childish nonsense? I mean, you see this with Susan Blackmore, you see it with Michael Shermer, you see it with that Dave guy, you see it, like across the board, you see this. And then, they go into the next phase of their lives, essentially, with this. They're still pursuing it, deep down, they still want the transcendent, they still want the big, mysterious, spiritually loaded thing, but they don't trust themselves anymore, right? And Carl Sagan is another figure who's worth pointing to here, because I mean, if you watch the Cosmos series, the thing that people love about Cosmos is that this kind of will to the spiritual. I mean, he's just dripping in it the whole time,
Mhm.
and kind of in denial about it, in a way, because he was one of those guys too. He was somebody who felt like the truth couldn't be touchy-feely. The truth couldn't be something that's actually uplifting. It had to be this cold, hard thing, that, these blunt facts that don't care about your feelings. And so, yeah, I mean, being able to look at the world in a way that kind of affirms that, not in this kind of like muted way, but in the sense that, like, hey, maybe there really is spirit. Maybe that a lot of these fantastical things actually do just exist, and not only that, but we can demonstrate that they exist. That's another way in which the scientific attitude is important here. You're not just kind of waking people up to a different way of seeing the world, which is more optimistic. You're renewing their ability to trust their own guts, which I think is very important as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm feeling bad for materialism again. I want to just, because like, um, I don't know. I mean, bodies are bodies are important.
Mhm.
I think we have the wrong idea of bodies. Uh, And like physics has gone so far beyond bodies at this point that it's bizarre that um, there's this perception among some scientists and the general public, the generally educated public, that science has proven materialism, or at least it's more likely that materialism is true as a result of science. When in fact, for 100 years, science has said bodies aren't actually the most real thing that exists. There's some other kind of quantum um, process going on that is non-local and is you could still call it deterministic if you want, but it's only probabilistically deterministic. Like we know the general region in which things will occur, but not exactly where things will occur. So it's a kind of if it's still deterministic, it's like um, not in the sense of knowing exactly in space and time where and when something will happen, but knowing where it's most likely to occur. But yeah, the point is bodies don't exist anymore for physicists. There's bodies are mere appearances, and what's real from a physical point of view is quantum process. And quantum process is bizarre as hell. And Feynman's not wrong to really emphasize that if, as he said, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't, because uh, it destroys our substance uh, metaphysics. And in other words, it destroys Aristotelian logic. It destroys the ideas of simple location and nature at an instant, as Whitehead described them, and forces us to think in terms of fields on the one hand, right? So we move beyond bodies and particles to fields, but also, like we're saying, it feels like something to vibrate through a field. And feeling, when we talk about these basic concepts in physics, like a force, and we can try to, you know, sidestep this question by saying, oh, gravity is just a geometrical curvature of space-time. But, no, gravity, if it has any meaning, is something we feel. We only know what gravity is because, we're literally pulled into our chairs right now. And yes, we have mathematics to describe the way in which the bodies the bodies, right, that we observe around us are falling towards each other. But we give content to the concept of gravity because of how we feel weight, and we extrapolate from that into this abstract matrix of mathematical ideas about gravitation. Um, but it's we're rooted in our own uh, subjective encounter with whatever the gravitational field is. And all of our geometry springs from our embodiment. But it's an embodiment that's like my body is the entire cosmos. It's not just a skin-bound body. And so, we were talking earlier about how animals have group souls. Their ego is in some sense outside of them. Their ego is the environment, and they sense their ego as if it was outside them, whereas human beings have the ego inside of us. But, I think the challenge for us in our materialistic cultural epoch is is to not just imagine that the I, that our sense of self-consciousness is uh, our private possession, but to experience it as a gift from the cosmic periphery, right? We are our existence, our being is a gift from the cosmic periphery or from the environment. And we need to get in touch with our animal nature in a sense, but we don't want to just revert to that sense of immersion in a group soul. We need to recognize that our own egos are a gift in a way that also empowers us to be individuals, and that mm, it's a as Barfield would put it, it's final participation, not original participation, or as Gebser would put it, we're stepping into the integral. We're not resubmerging ourselves in the archaic. And so there's a kind of freedom required here, whereas before it was just a cosmic necessity. Now there's a freedom involved in our own recognition and our own acceptance of this fact that our own individuality is a gift um, from the cosmos. Because there's a certain attitude that's like individuality is so important. Like we can't, like I'm all about non-duality and Advaita and stepping into a more unified form of consciousness, but we can't lose our individuality in that. But I feel like we maintain our individual freedom at the same time that we recognize this deeper form of communion by experiencing our own individuality as a gift and accepting, like receiving the gift and really saying thank you. Like you've given that to me. And now I have the responsibility to live up to that, to step into that recognition of being one with everything.
Oh yeah. Okay. All right. There's all kinds of directions I could take this in. All right. So, well, this one thing that I should mention here, I think, is that earlier when we first started chatting, I was talking about like a self-conceptualization and actually conceptualizing the self itself as a kind of transcendental object or eternal object or an ideal, right? In the very fact that it is a form, it is also a kind of ideal. A form, for a form to actually manifest in the world, it has to take a multiplicity and unify it. And so in a sense, the form of selfhood itself is kind of the metaform. It's kind of the monad in a sense, because it's the form of unity as such, without any kind of other specifying contents. And there's a really interesting relationship here, I think, between subjectivity, let's say, in this much more kind of cosmic sense, and physicality, the sensory matter bodies. Because Steiner talks about the way in which we like, when we're thinking of things in physicalistic terms, we like to think of everything as these bodies that are defined by like weight and extended surfaces, right? So like a barrier which divides objects from one another, right? And if you look at like Hegel and Zizek, the way that they talk about subjectivity as this thing that kind of carves itself out of a background, as it were, that in order for there to be a sense to the feeling of the feeling of I am, there has to be a kind of negation that happens. There has to be a kind of like I am, and so I am not, whatever is beyond that boundary, right? And so it's like the initial boundary between internality and externality is that primordial feeling of the form of forms, the metaform, the monad, the ideal of unity itself, which then creates this kind of division. And then you look at physicalism, and you've got this thing where we're taking this idea of little BBs, little concrete physical objects, which are defined entirely in terms of their self-identity. When we think of a physical object, that's exactly what we think of. There's this boundary between the inside and the outside, and the physical object sustains its identity against that of other objects. And so there's a sense, I think we can say, in which this physicalist paradigm, in a way, it's actually taking subjectivity, reifying it into this fundamental principle of matter, and then projecting it out onto everything. So like with the way that we think about like heat dynamics or fluid dynamics, our mathematics treats it as though all fluids and all gases and all heat are just these little BBs bouncing around. And every one of those BBs you can see it as kind of a projection of the basic contents of subjectivity itself, right? And so even beyond the ways in which that might be misplaced concreteness, to what extent is it not misplaced? To what extent is there something about bodiliness itself which is actually a concretization of the basic form of subjectivity? If hopefully that made some kind of sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. The self as the metaform, the form of forms, as it were. And I can't help but so there's a Christian impulse in me and a Buddhist impulse in me here. Like to think of the self as the be all and end all, and then to think of the self as empty, actually. It's like the self is the form of forms or the self is emptiness. The Christian and the Buddhist path. And these are just different ways of talking about the same thing. But I'm not fully satisfied with that relativism. I feel like, am I going to say it? I feel like Christianity transcends and includes Buddhism in a way. I mean, because I agree with Steiner. It's hard to
Yeah,
disagree.
yeah.
I am a Buddhist. I sincerely, deeply like affirm the wisdom and the compassion that is so obviously incarnate in that stream of culture. But I'm also a Christian, which is to say, Christ inhabits me. I can't help it. It just happened. I found out that Christ is inside of me. I don't know if I mean that's it's a weird way of putting it, maybe, but it's literally as Steiner would say, it's the way that the sun is obvious in our sensory experience, like it rises every day and there it is. It lets us see things. There's a in my soul life, there's this being, Christ, who's there that illuminates my inner experience. And it's just as obvious as the sun outside. And so I can't deny that. And it's like Buddha's in there too, but Christ is I think in some ways a more forceful um energy. It's more about form and metaform, yeah. Whereas Buddha is more about emptiness. And I
Mhm.
don't want to lose sight of either of these poles for a second. It's crucial to maintain the tension between emptiness and form here. But form fucking wins, obviously. Otherwise, I wouldn't be seeing you, you wouldn't be seeing me, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. Form wants to be,
Well,
right?
there's that, but then there's also this other thing going on here, because I completely agree that Christianity um, goes beyond Buddhism. But at the same time, there's this really interesting little dialectic going on here where within Western traditions, well, let me say it this way first. Within all human spiritual, metaphysical, intellectual traditions, you have a division between transcendence and immanence. And within the Western tradition, that is conceptualized in such a way that transcendence is form and immanence is formlessness, right? And so you see this in Plato's Chora, you see this in Plotinus's discussion of matter as the kind of darkening of form, right? And then on the other hand, with the Eastern tradition, you have transcendence conceptualized as oneness and immanence conceptualized as separation. And so they mirror one another. in this really interesting way, because that oneness is like you said, is an emptiness. It is a formlessness. And in Plotinus, I love Plotinus's discussion of this. It is so fascinating because he's taking Plato's notion of the chora and he's really hammering down on this question of what this is, this emptiness that somehow has to be a receptacle for form in order for there to be anything at all. There has to be this negation. There has to be this nothingness, this emptiness, this abground, groundless ground, right? It has to be there somehow. So what is it? Because it doesn't fit into the traditional Platonic scheme where it's like you've got forms which are conceptualized through noesis, and then you have the bodily world, which is experienced through sensation. And this formlessness is somehow neither. So what could it possibly be? The way that Plato talks about this, he says, well, it's got to exist somehow, but however we cognize it, it's got to be some kind of bastard reckoning, is what he calls it, because it can't be the perception of form or sensation. But I think what you find here is this intersection of form and formlessness, literally and on an intellectual level within Christianity, because then subjectivity itself has to be that, right? The way that Plotinus says this, he says that whatever this chora is, this emptiness, he almost chastises it. It's almost like he's like, how dare you stop being so bad, darkness. I need you to conform to this metaphysics of light that my boy Plato created. But he says this thing that is so illuminating, pun intended. He says that whatever darkness pretends to be, it is not. Whatever it tells you, it's lying. He says that the formlessness, the chora, the emptiness, it is in a sense the form of mere apparentness, right? And so reality versus appearance within Platonic cosmology. So what would apparentness be? It's experientiality, right? And that's exactly what we see in the Buddhist traditions and all these Eastern traditions, that the condition for the possibility of being aware of anything is awareness as such, right? The emptiness which preconditions that. And so what that then implies, I believe, is that subjectivity itself, that I amness there, right? The burning bush, it says to Moses, I am that I am. And that phrase has been interpreted in all these different kinds of ways. But then immediately after that, Moses says, well, then which God should I tell the Hebrew people sent me to them? And the bush replies, tell them I am sent you.
The bush replies.
It's subjectivity itself.
Mhm.
That's exactly what it is. And so that means that Christ is the incarnation of that. And that means that the awakening of Christ within is recognizing that our own subjectivity itself is that. It is the most primordial kind of intersection of form and formlessness. So, okay,
Right.
I got way too excited there, so I'm going to shut up for a minute. But yeah, this is something I've been thinking very hard about lately, if you can't tell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the Heros Gamos that's at the core of Plato's Timaeus, right? Between the intellect, the nous, and the receptacle, where you need
Mhm.
form and formlessness or emptiness to create a cosmos. Cosmogenesis is the interplay of these poles. And in Plotinus, you have the one beyond being. It's beyond the intellect. You can't even think it. You just dissolve and are no longer. There's no one knower and known anymore. You're one with that which is, and then at the very bottom of Plotinus's emanational scheme, you have matter, and matter is just as the one is beyond being. The one is in a sense formless. matter is also formless. And there's
Mm.
this weird coincidence of opposites, I think, already evident in Plotinus. And Plotinus renders this as a, an outflow and an inflow, an involution and an evolution. And so there's a going out from and then a return back to the one in Plotinus. But I think that's just his way of making sense of the strange correspondence between the one in matter, or the one and the many, if you want to put it that way. And so when we think about the body, when we think about materialism, um, and I mean the whole, I think, spiritual import of Christianity is the incarnation, and the way in which the body, the matter, the earth becomes so important, becomes so crucial and central. That's what God wanted to save. The body, human embodied mortal existence, is what God wanted to value as the highest possible reality. And so, like, the Christ event, we think is incredible for us as human beings to believe in. And like Tertullian was like, I believe because it is incredible. So this idea of like faith and reason often is like, well, yeah, we know it's absurd. But it's not just absurd for human beings that the incarnation happened. It's absurd for the gods. It's absurd for the spiritual world. They're like, wait, Christ did what? he's, he's the sun being became an earth being, like, why? And I mean, love and freedom is the answer to why, which is, I think, the rest of the spiritual world very quickly caught on to why Christ did it, because of love and freedom, which is something that only mortal human beings could be capable of. And so the spiritual world entering into the material world through this deed of, the Christ being, it's a kind of cosmic inversion. And it happened very recently in the history of Earth, in the history of the whole cosmos. Um, and we think of Christianity as some kind of old religion. And, it's old for us as skin encapsulated egos, because it's, yeah, oh my gosh, 2000 years. That's like one, maybe two incarnations. Like we really need to expand our sense of time to be a little bit more long term here and
We're
recognize.
just beginning to get acclimated, or even just beginning to recognize what it is that we're supposed to be getting acclimated to. Um,
Yeah.
because yeah, I mean, it's like there's something utterly absurd about Christianity, and that is the power of it. It's very interesting that in the early days of Christianity, there were certainly the more intellectual mystics and whatnot, and later on the Neoplatonists really kind of merged their way of thinking with Christianity. And in many ways, you could see Christianity as kind of a merger of Platonism and Judaism. But in any case, a lot of early Christianity was just normal people who really were just operating on this kind of gut instinct. They just experienced it, which is itself really incredible. But I think it also resulted in this world in which you have millions of people walking around every day who call themselves Christians, and they say that they believe the things and that they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they have absolutely no idea what Christianity is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Belief and knowledge, like you have to come to this Christ event through science, after science, like not before. You can't, it's not something to be believed in, and that's a big problem. Uh,
Yeah, it's a mystery, but the connection here with science, this is also something that is really just incredible in its own way, because it seems to me, in a way, you could say that science, or maybe even more specifically physicalistic science, is this compulsion that we feel as a kind of aftershock of Christianity to like confront that darkness of matter, of the bodily world, and somehow reckon with it. And so Heidegger, within the question concerning technology, and actually this is really just a theme throughout a lot of Heidegger's later work, well, and Being in Time, really just his whole career. This idea that this idea of enframing, this idea that we're taking that which is of nature and we're abstracting it out of the life world through Vorhandenheit, and we're transforming it into this standing reserve. And if you really back up and look at what Heidegger's saying through the lens of Plotinus, what Heidegger's saying is that that modern left brain Vorhandenheit intellect is trying to dematerialize matter, is trying to suck the darknesses out of it, the indeterminacy, the aphanopoiesis, the chaos, the all the things that Plotinus seemed to be like morally chastising when he talked about the prima materia. Materialism, ironically, seems to be trying to transform matter, ironically, into these perfect crystalline embodiments of our most abstract ideas, which is to say mathematical ideas. So materialism, rather than being this thing that over affirms matter, in a sense, it's exactly the opposite of that. It is a war on the body, it is a war on materiality. And it makes you wonder then, okay, well, if that's the case, then what would happen if science wasn't at war with matter? And it could actually make friends with matter, you know? And I feel like in a lot of ways, that's what Steiner.
Yeah.
That we need to stick with that which is actually present, that which is actually there in the phenomena, instead of getting lost in our abstractions and then trying to slap that grid onto the world the way that Newton and others have done.
Yeah. I mean, the Goethean method of doing science is, like you were saying earlier, harnessing empathy as a way of knowing, as an organ of perception, falling in love with matter.
Mm.
And when you fall in love with matter, you see that matter is full of form. Matter wants to express itself. Matter wants to communicate itself. Like matter is the medium through which spirit communicates. What else could it be? And it's not about rejecting or turning away from it, but embracing it, really. Alan Watts used to talk about like materialism as we usually think of it actually is doesn't really care about matter at all because it leads to this form of architecture that's so dead and alienating, and it treats matter like it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and if we really cared about matter, we would create a more beautiful world than the world that industrial civilization has produced. And so it's like,
I don't know matter personally, but I have a feeling it's not into being turned into strip malls, just on an intuitive level. But then again,
yeah,
I'm joking, but we definitely know matter personally. I mean, what do we know more personally? And Nietzsche, this is where Nietzsche comes in, despite the fact that Nietzsche kind of fell into the abyss of his own ego. Nietzsche was also a guy who absolutely hammered on this point that, when we go down this Cartesian road and we say like, oh, well, I could be a brain in the vat. Like, shut up. No, you can't. You definitely have a body. Here are your hands. Like you exist. Like, this is what is more certain than your embodiment. Like,
yeah,
if you're calling that into question, then you're completely lost in the clouds because you've fallen in love with your intellectual fantasy world. And that's one thing that Nietzsche was preaching against the entire time. That this will to escapism, it's not just dangerous. It's fueled by all of our worst impulses, our sense of inadequacy, our feelings of resentment, those are all there in our will to get the last laugh by flying off into some kind of puffy cloud heaven where we don't have to deal with existing in these dirty, malformed bodies, and we don't have to deal with our boss and our family, and it'll be this nice, perfect, pristine world where everything's okay. Or we could embrace life. We could actually say, you know what, this is actually pretty cool, let's keep doing this. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
definitely don't think you can be an actual Christian without affirming that. And that's one of the things that made me feel really iffy about figures like Seraphim Rose. He might have been a brilliant person, but at the same time, even through the darkness, even through the labyrinthine belly of Ahriman, we're here to enjoy the ride, not to die alone in a cabin, I believe.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. There's a lot coming up for me while you were talking there, and I think the technological impulse that Heidegger was speaking to maybe is what I'll address first. You were um, speaking to that way that we get modern technological civilization is so obsessed with tools and the readiness to hand of nature made artificial, to serve our purposes. And I think of the 20th century as this Faustian bargain with technology, that we not only embraced this impulse to master nature. We totally failed at that, as the ecological crisis is making clear. But we embraced this impulse to technologically master the human being. And Heidegger was oddly initially, you know, as a Nazi, in favor of that attempt, um, and never repented for it. But he did interestingly say, I think it was in the 50s, maybe it was the early 60s, he was asked specifically about his support of the Nazi Party, and he said, "Well, industrial agriculture is no worse than the gas chambers. And so all you Western liberal countries that are treating animals like uh, raw materials for your own nourishment, as if they didn't have a life of their own, I mean, that's just as bad as what we did to the Jews." And it's like, whoa, okay. I see where you're going with that one. Uh, Not sure you're fully acknowledging your own support of a kind of your own moral failing in that. But if you want to throw tar on us too, I think it's fair. But
Well, that's yet another one of the pitfalls in all this, and it's why I feel like spiritual awakening has become such a buzzword online lately. As though it's just like some kind of like self-help program or something. And the thing is, when becoming disillusioned with modernity, becoming disillusioned with physicalism, um, that is not necessarily a surefire way to lead you to good ideas. Whenever we are in a state of plasticity, where our we have our way of thinking of the world, our way of behaving, our way of orienting ourselves, and we develop it usually at a pretty young age, and at a certain point it comes to kind of rigidify, usually in our late teens or early 20s. And then, not for everybody, but for most people, we get into this kind of rigidified way of viewing the world. And that rigidification, in a way, is kind of necessary. It does kind of protect us in a way. It does kind of stabilize our lives and allow for um, human lives to interlock in cohesive ways and create society. So that process of solidification is not an evil in itself necessarily. It does serve a necessary process, I believe. But when you're calling these things into question about modernity and you start liquefying those boundaries, that edifice of ideology and whatnot, then you're in a vulnerable state. You're in a state of plasticity where you're going to want something else that feels solid. You're going to want something else that feels like the answer. And that can be extremely dangerous, I think, because it's not hard with hindsight to look back on Heidegger and see what he apparently saw in the Nazis. He saw the Nazis as rejecting liberal fractional reserve banking and whatnot. He saw it as a kind of a return to the earth and an affirmation of traditional culture as opposed to this kind of mechanistic abstract intellectualism. And if you try and put yourself in his shoes, assuming he didn't know about the gas chambers, which I don't know if he did or he didn't, but assuming he did not, putting yourself in his shoes back in the 1930s, it's not hard to see how in his state of disillusionment he would have looked to that as like, okay, at least there's a path forward, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if
And
you go,
it
yeah.
wasn't. It was the exact opposite of that. It turned out to be the everything that he was preaching against.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think it's true that if you if you go back 100 years and we're at the beginning of the 20th century and you consider the human cost of fascism, communism, and liberalism, liberal capitalism, you would basically think, okay, those are three examples of modernity that have all been uh, rather extremely homicidal, that have led to a lot of war and death and extermination and of human beings and ecological devastation. I mean, we can complain about capitalism's ecological consequences. Communism doesn't have a much better track record. Fascism wasn't around long enough for us to really say, but probably not. A lot of I'm not going to go there with that joke. I mean, emissions, were high under fascism as well, and so these three ideologies are murderous. Um, and so the modern political project, in whichever of these three inflections it has taken, has been inhumane and ecologically suicidal. And so here we are at the beginning. I mean, we're in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, and looking back at this pile of bodies in the 20th century because of wars waged because of these three ideologies. And we don't have anything new really to work with at the level of intellectual, schemes and like political programs. We have the same broken human beings and the same really bad political ideologies. And so, what is it that we haven't tried yet? Like, is there an alternative form of modernity that might allow us to thread this needle? And I think that's that alternative form of modernity is precisely like taking the Goethean path instead of the Newtonian path, right? It's taking the path of maybe nature is not the sort of thing we could master. Maybe human nature is not the sort of thing we could technologically control. Maybe we are alive, maybe nature is alive, and we need to develop a relational way of knowing, which leads to a conception of, say, like the state, the government, not as a machine that's going to impose law upon us, but as an organism that we're going to be able to relate to in a human way, um, where like, yeah, maybe we do need institutions. We do need a sense of a public sphere and even of you know a domain where we engage in politics to us to defend rights and establish responsibilities that we have to one another. But we can do that in a way that's like, acknowledging that we are each conscious human beings and that these abstract rules or laws that we might try to impose upon our lives, that we're always going to need to interpret those laws. And we have judges for that. We have juries for that. But like our justice system is very clearly, not functioning very well because we have such a mechanistic conception of the state. We think of it as something separate from ourselves. We think of the police as this external, this occupying army, and they do function that way in many cities. Um, I think that, there's a way of relating to the social body and to the political function in a more um, human way that wouldn't mechanize the process. And so we need to do that within our societies to transform politics, and we need to change our mechanistic conception of nature and not imagine that, we human beings are that our economy somehow exists outside of the ecological flows of Gaia. And remember that, our human economy, our monetary system exists only because Gaia has given it permission to exist. This is like the whole Neolithic revolution, the agricultural project is just a function of Gaia deciding this shall be an interglacial period. You know, um, and I don't mean to overly anthropomorphize Gaia here, but just to make the point that like our whole human economy is very much existent in the context of these larger Earth cycles that we're not going to be able to control. We might try to with various geoengineering ploys, but that's just gonna throw 14 more wrenches into an already very dangerous situation. Um, so yeah, humility is called for here, and I think Heidegger was right to critique technological and framing um, of nature and of the human, and the way beyond that, I think, is yeah, this alternative modernity and cultivating empathy as a way of knowing, and cultivating imagination as a way of knowing, and recognizing that the human being and the cosmos, mind and nature, are not actually two separate things.
Well, Heidegger's ultimate sin, ironically, I think, is that he was part of this current within the German tradition, which goes all the way back to Schopenhauer, of kind of idealizing the Eastern view of philosophy in contrast to the Western. Heidegger, in a way, his disillusionment with modernity was also kind of a disavowal of the Western tradition itself, because he saw the entire Western tradition as driven by this will to erase being. I think more specifically than that, we can say it was a kind of will to erase the immanence of being, the darkness of being. I think Richard Tarnas really touches upon this within the epilogue to the Passion of the Western Mind, when he talks about there is this kind of psychosexual element at play here within Western man kind of confronting the great mother that is formlessness, that is Gaia and whatnot. And so anyway, Heidegger, he kind of ends up feeling very alienated from the Western tradition itself. He postures himself as this kind of post-metaphysical thinker that can look back on the entire Western tradition and chastise it for being so bad. But in the process of doing that, he lost the one thing that was really the core driving ethos of the Western tradition from the very beginning, the I amness. And so he was able to see the Nazis as a solution to that problem, because the one thing that should have alarmed him was that the collectivism of the Nazis, the way that they crushed human individuality to shove human beings into these very mechanistic regiments and factories and whatnot. Steiner saw that exactly for what it was from the very beginning, and Heidegger couldn't.
Mm. Oh.
So ultimately, then, when we're talking about a new modernity, we could to riff on, I was it Bruno Latour, I believe he said, we have never been modern. Modernity should be the realization of a kind of individual freedom, not just in the sense of liberation, but in the sense of a kind of creative agency and moral agency and intellectual agency that have never fully germinated. And so I think I want to kind of loop this back around to what I was saying much earlier about how we're not quite ready to go and start some kind of new modernity yet, because in order to do that, we have to actually be modern first. And in a sense, we never have. We have never developed those powers yet, and we're in the process of doing that. But once we have, then I think that's what's going to really open up new possibilities for us. It's not like new technologies could be great, new ways of doing ecology and whatnot. But I think it's the one thing that has to be conserved in a new kind of modernity is human individuality, because that's what this entire process has been attempting to cultivate. And so we somehow have to figure out how to have socialization and solidarity and communality while also maintaining individualism. And I don't think that's ever been done before, ever. I mean, when you look to the closest approximations of self-sufficient communal human life, you can point to the Mennonites and the Amish, or even to modern tribal hunter-gatherers. But all of those examples have social technologies which are intentionally oriented towards crushing individual human agency and reintegrating the human being into the collective. Somehow we have to figure out how to achieve that end, the end of social cohesion, without crushing that.
Mm.
And instead look at it the other way, that somehow individual agency is what will facilitate that kind of solidarity.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. The importance of the individual, and the importance of remembering that individuals are the products of loving communities. So you can't really value one without the other. Um, okay, we have two roads we could go down, Keelan. I have to pee, so I could either go take a piss and
So
come
do I.
back.
Okay.
uh, and then we could continue for however long we want to. So I think that's the road we're going to take, right?
Let's bathroom break, and you want to look at the chat, and because we haven't looked at that. I have it open on my phone, so I've been kind of glancing at it, but maybe
I've
we
been
get
glancing as well. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, my impression is mostly there was one guy who had a beef with me at some point. Evidence of God, I think, was his handle, but otherwise, mostly people have been talking to themselves. Someone even commented, like, people in this chat really like to talk about themselves. But yeah, let's go take a
Yes,
piss
I've
and
succeeded. I've attracted all the people who still have their egos intact. Lovely. Okay, all right.
be
Bathroom
back in
break.
a minute.
Okay. I guess I probably could have turned my camera off, huh? Oh well. Okay, guys, so here's what we're gonna do. Matt isn't back yet, but let's do this kind of like Q&A style, because we're definitely not gonna scroll through all this and pick out random things to comment on. That seems like a dumb idea. So if anyone has any questions who would like to pitch them to us, or comments or concerns, or just saying hi, or whatever you're into, now would be the time for that.
I'll take questions. I'm not taking concerns. They can keep their concerns.
Concerns are for me only. Matt's not doing concerns.
No, I'm just kidding. I'll take concerns. I'll consider taking concerns. Keelan, have you heard about Pope Francis opening up these portals?
No, but evidently I should have heard of that.
Oh
Tell me
yeah, so
all the
he's
juicy
opening up
deets.
5 portals. It's a thing that popes do like every is it every 25 years? It's like it's the Catholic version of the Jubilee or something. They open up these portals that like people can pass through and like all their sins are forgiven, and then they brick them up, they close them up after a certain amount of time. But I just think it's cool. It's like magic. And actually reading about that earlier tonight was, or this afternoon was what made me feel like I wanted to do a dialogue like this uh, as a way of opening up our own kind of portal. So, um, any questions coming through?
Somebody asked if I'm going to leave this up. Yeah, I'll definitely leave this one up. Sometimes, like if I just turn, like if I ever get rid of a live stream, it's because I randomly decided to live stream just for the hell of it. And usually when I do that, it involves me saying a lot of dumb stuff that I don't necessarily want to be on the internet forever. So, but now I have another person who also has said dumb stuff on camera, and so we can be dumb on the internet forever together.
Oh yeah,
That
yeah.
makes it different, yeah.
As long as it's a dialogue of idiocy,
Exactly.
it's at least entertaining. So
Exactly.
totally fine leaving it up as well. Uh,
Decentralized internet. I am afraid to tell you people that there has never been a decentralized internet.
True.
You guys know that there's like 10 times more Reddit accounts for, what is it called? Fort. Oh, it's one of those major U.S. military bases. It has like 10 times more Reddit accounts for that military base than there are actual people at the military base. I wonder
Interesting.
why that could be.
Wow. Yeah.
I wish I could
Yeah.
remember the name of it. I want to say like Fort. Ah, geez, I can't think of it. It's one of the ones that's like really heavily associated with like intelligence operations and that kind
Well,
of
yeah, I mean,
thing.
when I think about ChatGPT and like they basically have infinite money and they're like what's the most amount of text that we could train this thing on? And they're like, we got to talk to the NSA because the NSA has everything. And so
The
the and
NSA.
it's technically it's not like there's no copyright infringement because the NSA is not supposed to have it anyway, but they have some loophole where they are allowed to have it. And so it's like as long as you go through that loophole. So and like, you know, the government's at least on January 21st going to be wanting to cut the budget. And so I'm sure ChatGPT is going to be able to get even more information because they'll be like, we got infinite money. NSA, give us your data. Let us train our AI, and then we'll make sure the US gets to use that AI as a weapon and not China. And that's basically the situation the situation we're in because we've mistaken uh we've imagined that intellect is something that we could master technologically, that nous is something that we could control algorithmically, computationally, when in fact it's not that at all. It's cosmic life. It's streaming into us from the periphery. We're never going to be able to like control it inside a server farm or something. Um,
Yeah,
so
this is a thought that's occurred to me recently. It's like there there's nothing more dangerous in a way than the illusion of freedom, and the internet is kind of perfect for that now, especially with the how developed artificial intelligence has been. I mean, with the spotlights, of course, on things like chat gpt, but I mean, algorithms have been controlling what we see on Facebook and YouTube and whatnot forever. That this is nothing new, and so the capacity to use these things to manufacture consent is absolutely incredible. And it's even made me wonder, like, the degree to which um, even my own stuff, like, I'm just wondering, like, would this video have gotten like 300,000 views normally if there wasn't some kind of AI algorithm that was like, okay, we will let the people have a little bit of weird metaphysics now as a treat because of some kind of crazy CIA like psyop thing, and so it's occurred to me, like, I mean, if that path continues far along enough to the point that even the people who think of themselves as the most cerebral and discerning have their beliefs basically curated by the machine, will the only people left who are able to really resist that be people who are quite literally the mentally unstable people, the mad, right? The people who maybe actually are schizophrenic, who are able to maintain some kind of channel to uh, the cosmic intelligences that are beyond Ahriman. Maybe that's a bit too apocalyptic, but it would make for a great sci-fi novel either way.
Hmm.
You guys in the chat can have that one for free. Just make sure to credit me when your sci-fi novel becomes very popular.
I've been reading William James's last book. It was a lecture cycle he gave in 1909 called A Pluralistic Universe. And he's most of the book he's like lambasting idealism, rationalism, as he calls it. Intellectualism is another word he uses actually. Um, he goes after Hegel a lot, and there's another German philosopher who's his hero in that book, Gustav Fechner,
Mm.
who's like a panpsychist. It's like the Earth is an angel, the sun is an angel. Like we're just the universe is a series of nested consciousnesses going out and out forever. Um, and yeah, James talks about the way in which um, oh, hold on, I have a visitor. Come on, come on, jump. Come on. All right, he's getting camera shy. Oh,
We got one question in the chat, and I don't understand the question. Womp womp
uh,
womp.
but yeah, in the pluralistic universe, James gets into this whole, he unpacks the debate between intellectualism and Bergsonianism, vitalism, his own form of pluralism. Um, and yeah, he's really trying to hold it down for this idea that reality is unfinished and that we shouldn't rush toward the idea that wholeness is necessary, that like it's all predestined, like it's determined in advance that everything's going to work out and resolve into oneness, and that instead we should embrace this view that oneness is a possibility. Wholeness is available, but it's not inevitable. And actually, to achieve that is only ever going to be a temporary sort of feat, and that yeah, ultimately we're always going to need to achieve it afresh, anew, and so he wants us to embrace a sense of an open evolutionary process instead of imagining that being attuned to the spiritual essence would mean, you know, realizing what is always already eternally true, but instead, like, there's a real adventure here. There's a real mission. There's a real sense of what is yet to be achieved, and that the emphasis on form I was talking about earlier is not to deny the all-pervasive emptiness, but to indicate the way forward and
Mhm.
to embrace the creative advance and to uh, not fall prey to a sense of resting on our laurels.
Absolutism, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about, even with Steiner. Steiner saw future Vulcan as this kind of inevitable state in which everything would be finally resolved into a kind of ultimate unity. But and Chardin saw it the same way as well with the Omega point. But I can't help but wonder, doesn't it, with what we see in nature, doesn't it kind of make more sense that that Omega point would be something that we're just asymptotically approaching forever? Wouldn't that be more interesting than the story just concluding in that way? I should give some credit to Steiner here. Even for Steiner, future Vulcan would be kind of the completion for now, but that would really just be the stage in which we become the cosmic beings for the next
Oh yeah.
cycles which would come about. I mean, when we look at the up at the stars, if we see it within the context of Steiner's narrative, every single one of those stars is it's either already gone through the process that our solar system is going through right now, and it has emerged fully formed, or it's being prepared for that.
Mhm.
And so even with Steiner, you've got this kind of endless spiral in a sense.
It's an infinite
But
fractal. Yeah.
yeah, fractal. But I feel like James is saying something a little bit even more so than that. He's not just saying that it goes on forever and has to be continually renewed. He's saying maybe there isn't a kind of transcendental guarantee at all, or rather, maybe this is the best way of putting it, actually, that prior to the Christ event, there was, in a sense, a kind of transcendental guarantee, because the I am, as it were, was something we were kind of still swimming in. But now, if there's a transcendental, if there's a transcendental guarantee, it's us. We are the
Mm.
transcendental guarantee, right?
Right.
Because we've
Mhm.
internalized that now. The training wheels are off, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what Barfield meant by final participation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the training wheels are off. We now have a directly creator relation to the rest of the cosmos, we as human beings. And that's a lot of responsibility. And it's no surprise that I mean, and thankfully we have thousands of years to prepare for fully taking on this responsibility, but it's already the fact that we're going to need to take it on is already available to those of us who are paying attention. And like for the rest of the species to, you know, become aware of the fact that we're involved in this spiritual process of evolution that is many lifetimes in the making. Um, that's a much bigger project. And I think, it's interesting. Steiner actually specifically like singles out William James for criticism and the whole pragmatist tradition in his book Riddles of Philosophy. But as much as I appreciate deeply, like appreciate Steiner's contribution. I feel like he doesn't get James, and I feel like there are many places in Steiner where he talks about the American folk soul and American consciousness in a way that, and the difference between it and German or Central European consciousness, which is his own locale where he's speaking out of. And it's almost like he's saying anthroposophy in the United States will be different from anthroposophy in Germany.
Mm.
So whatever William James is doing, it could be that only American anthroposophists can understand it. German anthroposophists have to come out of the German idealist tradition to make sense of the spiritual world. American anthroposophists come out of the pragmatist tradition and find their own unique way of making sense of the spiritual world. And I feel like James's anti-intellectualism, his anti-idealism, his anti-rationalism is instructive because it forces us to continually ask the question, like, what is this for? And
Mm.
what is this doing to change our lives? How is this practically, what is its practical value? He would say, what is its cash value? And people would say, oh, he's therefore supporting neoliberal capitalism or something. But by cash value, he's using this metaphor that's like, what is its social and material payoff? Like, what does it allow you to do in the world? And I think if we allow our spiritual ideas to just become ways of painting pretty pictures and not, ways of transforming the world, then we're missing an opportunity. And so, James's orientation and his insistence that we stay attuned to experience and not allow our abstractions and our ideas and concepts to mislead us, not allow logic to get in the way of life. Like all of that is very much in support of what I hear Steiner always saying as well. And so it's one of the ways that Steiner's vision and insight and genius, I think, is it's a sign of the limitation of his view because he's so critical of James. And I mean, James is a nominalist. I have criticisms of James too, but there's so much to value there. And I feel like Steiner misses that. But then on the other hand, Steiner also is always, well, and actually not always, but in a few lectures, like saying, like, look, what I say to German anthroposophists is only relevant to German anthroposophists, and American anthroposophists are going to come out of a totally different point of view and be just as valid. And so, our own defense of William James is just a function of our unique situatedness, perhaps. Um, if I'm lucky,
Yeah, I
I'll
mean,
one day have a chance to rewrite, or someone, if it's not me, will have a chance to rewrite the philosophy of freedom out of the American pragmatist tradition in the American pragmatist idiom instead of out of the German idealist idiom, because you could arrive at the same basic insight from either cultural context, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that James is, and there is something so uh Goethean about it, that this attitude that a truth has to be something that you do,
Mm.
that there's something really powerful about that. And relating this to Steiner, then I mean, I don't think it would just be kind of rewriting the philosophy of freedom. I mean, that might be an absolutely fantastic project in itself, but there's more than that, I would say, because I was listening to this guy. His name's Daniel Hoffner, who's an anthroposophist, and he's not a terribly prolific YouTuber, but he has some of the best discussions of anthroposophy on YouTube that I've ever seen. He's clearly an absolutely brilliant person, but he was kind of musing about Steiner and something I was listening to recently about the age of Michael. But he said about Steiner, he said, reading Steiner, it's kind of like if you've got a test and you've already got all the answers filled out, but you don't have the textbook. the test is supposed to be testing. So like you have all the like the answers there, but you don't have all of the path that's supposed to lead you to them. And so it's like you're having to think your way backwards through everything when you're trying to think with Steiner. And I think it's a really accurate way of putting it. I feel like there's a lot of things that Steiner saw that are true that I feel like I've kind of corroborated by going through this grueling process of actually doing philosophy and trying to live it. But then there's a million other things in Steiner where I'm like, well, I mean, that sounds like it kind of fits into the rest of all this, but I don't really have any idea what you're talking about, Mr. Steiner. So, I mean, being able to take something like his version of Pseudo-Dionysius's celestial hierarchy, for example, and being able to take that and say, okay, here's how you actually live that, that would be something truly incredible. And when I looked at anthroposophy, the anthroposophy movement, I don't see anything like that. And it's very disappointing to me. And I assume the anthroposophy people will get upset at me for saying this, but I think it's absolutely true. They tend to see Steiner and his answers as just all there is to say. Like, oh, we know this because Steiner said so, and he could see into the Akasha. No, that's not good enough. I want them to
That's
see
not scientific. Yeah.
yeah, no, and that's completely antithetical to his entire attitude. I mean, I want you to be able to lay it out in a way that I can be like, yes, this is accurate, and now I can see why. And I mean, yeah, I mean, what better task to put to an American anthroposophy than that, to an American pragmatist anthroposophy, than really trying to take his more esoteric ideas, his more arcane ideas, and see where the rubber really meets the road. I feel like that's a task that is still at hand. I don't think anybody's really tackled that.
Yeah. There's a question related to Steiner, which is involving the relationship between reincarnation and Christianity, and whether or not we should hope that Christianity re-embraces, because it was there in, origin at the one of the church fathers, and was that the third century or something, like affirming reincarnation. It's there in the Jewish tradition as well. There's a version of reincarnation, but it's been lost. And so someone's asking if that's important to bring back into this, uh, Christian stream, and as we move into the future. And also, there's a question about Steiner's eu eugenics was the word that the person used, but we might ask about his racial theories. A lot of it comes right out of Blavatsky and the theosophical view of the history of the races. Um, people who are not familiar with Steiner, when they Google him, often now it's these questions about some of the things he said about various races is one of the top hits that comes back, and so it's hard not to yeah, engage with that question when you talk about Steiner to a general audience. But maybe but these aren't unrelated either. Reincarnation, I think, is one of the ways that Steiner helps us overcome a sense of racial essentialism, because in some sense we've all been every race if you uh, consider multiple incarnations. But yeah, maybe the Christianity and reincarnation question would, I mean, unless you want to connect the two, but what do you think about these questions?
Well, another thing worth mentioning here, if we're talking about the racial thing, is that Steiner was also very explicit that he did not believe in kind of a racial exclusivism to reincarnation. He believed that souls do migrate into different nationalities and ethnicities in order to accommodate the needs of the soul's karmic requirements. And he actually gives specific examples of this. But as for eugenics, I mean, maybe he said something about eugenics at some point. I'm not actually even familiar with him saying anything like that. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, he definitely said some things that modern people might find unsavory about race, but
Yeah,
did
I
he
mean,
for any kind of eugenics? I don't think he did. Did he?
well, he'll say things, there's a lecture where it's in the late 19 teens, I think, and he's talking about how there was a very popular novel in France at the time that was written by an African, and he was talking about how pregnant French women who read that novel might end up having mulatto babies because of the way the
Okay, all
imagination can,
right.
and he thought diluting European blood, so he was clearly, and but this is not unique to Steiner in the 1920s in Europe. You know, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a eugenicist. Like everybody before the Nazis was, becoming aware of evolution and Darwin, genetics, and realizing um, genetic stock matters and trying to think about what the implications of that are for society. And like you've got Herbert Spencer talking about social Darwinism, and like it was very much in the air. That like people were trying to be scientific about human morality and recognizing that if evolution is true and we take a scientific, which meant materialistic picture, a materialistic view seriously, then of course we should care about eugenics as a scientific, person. And then World War II happened and Nazism happened and the Holocaust happened. And it was like something shifted where we're like, okay, well, we can't look at that. We just can't ask those questions anymore
Mhm.
because it's too tempting and it leads to this totalitarian um, horror. Um, but eugenics is going to happen one way or another, even if we just let the marketplace decide. These technologies are coming into the marketplace where rich people are going to be able to decide like what is my child's IQ, what is my child's physiological characteristics. We will have the technologies for at least wealthy parents to be able to do eugenics. And so instead of the state deciding, the market decides. Or at least that's the liberal capitalist approach to eugenics. But
Mhm.
either way, we're having eugenics. Um, and this is where Heidegger's right. Like whether or not you frame in the liberal way or you frame in the Nazi way, you're still imposing technological mastery upon human nature and nature and committing atrocity. Um, and so, anyways, that's not to justify Steiner's racism. Um, there is that, and I think it's unfortunate. And but it's also, I think there's something unique about at least what I perceive to be the mission of America, the spiritual mission of America, if I can put it that way, which is different from what Steiner was speaking from, which is more the mission of the Central European peoples. And he was very explicit about the fact that he was speaking from that cultural point of view, and that American anthroposophists could rightly speak from a different point of view. And I think the United States is a different kind of project that's not nativist in the sense of that it's rooted in blood bonds. This country is founded on ideas. At least I would want to believe that this country is founded on the ideas of freedom and individual freedom and social justice is one way of simply capturing the ideals that I think found this country. And to think that this is a white country or to think that it's a Christian country or to try to reduce what the ideals of America are to one of these particular religions or particular bloodlines, I think is to is to miss an opportunity, and that really this country is exceptional in the sense that it's the it's the place where we're trying to discover the human being as a truly transnational um, being, as a being beyond the blood bond that could be really universal. And I think liberalism hasn't fully lived up to that ideal. And so this needs to be a conception of the individual and like universal human rights in a way that's post-liberal in a sense. But I do think that liberalism has at least pointed us in the right direction in emphasizing individual freedom and universal human rights as like important in a way that fascism and communism kind of missed a little bit. And I think
Indeed.
America is like ground zero for the realization of these values. And if we can't do it here, no one else is gonna be able to do it because no one else is as freed from those blood bonds because we're such a diverse country. I mean, Brazil is diverse, Europe's increasingly diverse, but like, and of course, there's a lot of racial tension. The diversity in the United States is very fractious, but I think we're closest to having some universal ideal of the human that is inclusive of, but also beyond any of those particular cultural diversities. We're
I
closer to
think
that in
that
this country than anywhere else. And so if we can't do it, I don't know who else can.
I think this is yeah, I think we're actually getting very close to what we touched upon earlier with this idea of the destiny of the United States and whatnot, because you know, societies historically have been able to cohere on the basis of one of two principles. And you can see it pretty much cut exactly down, east versus west here, where within the east, the fundamental principle has been cultural and ethnic homogeneity. The Chinese Empire, as it spread, its modus operandi was transforming conquered peoples into Han Chinese. That was just how they operated. You're going to do things like Han Chinese. You're going to speak our language. You're going to bathe like we do. You're going to use our currency. You're going to use our writing system. You're going to do your hair like Han Chinese, because to them that was how you established social order, was through that kind of homogeneity. Now in the West, the trajectory has always been in the opposite direction.
Hmm.
Even going back to like the Achaemenid Empire and Alexander the Great's empire and the Roman Empire. Within that Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world, it was just never conceivable to achieve that kind of homogeneity. There always had to be this attitude of a kind of laissez-faire in a way where okay, you can keep your gods, you can keep your cultural traditions, you can keep your ethnicity or whatever. Just pay your taxes to Rome, and we won't fucking kill you. Deal, and that was how it operated. And I feel like a lot of the more radically conservative tendencies in the West, whether they realize it or not, are actually kind of relapsing, much like Heidegger did, into a kind of valorization of an Eastern way of doing things, which is ironically completely antithetical to the entire Western ethos. And America, I think, is really the ground zero of this in a sense, because you've got a society that really can only achieve a kind of unified cohesion through a central teleology, a central mission, right? Because it's never going to be a sense of racial identity. It's never going to be a sense of like, oh, my ancestors were here for thousands of years. No, they weren't. Like, it's never going to be cultural homogeneity. I mean, these things just aren't going to happen. It's going to have to be interwoven through through a sense of shared destiny and meaning. And the unfortunate truth about that is when that sense of self identity, that sense of shared mission breaks down, it's a disaster because we don't have any other kind of glue holding us together. And so we have to do that right. And when we don't do it right, then we're at each other's throats. We devolve back into this bloodthirsty tribalism because that's the only thing underneath that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's kind of the fire under our asses, as it were, that necessitates us towards the realization of that other modernity, let's say, that we talked about previously.
Yeah. Yeah. That brings me to maybe our final pivot tonight can be to look ahead to 2025 and the second Trump administration and the near-term future of America. Um, because I feel like, yeah, like you're saying, if America does not have a spiritual mission, then it just reverts to being a very materialistic hegemon, like just America first, like let's just throw our weight around and get what's ours and get the best deal and like make sure that, we're as powerful as we can possibly be because like fuck everybody else, we're America. Um, and I feel like what the Trump is an opportunity to move away from what the it's not just the Democratic establishment, it's also the Republican establishment. Like um, establishment politics has been destroyed, and so the old the old New World Order is done. And is the future going to be a free for all, where a bunch of sort of Trump-like businessmen um, become leaders of government and try to get the best deal for their countries, or are we going to be able to maintain some sense of a shared human project? And like I was saying before, I think the human or the United States of America culturally has an important role to play in helping the world discover what it means to be a human being. But obviously, America has a lot to learn from the rest of the world too about what it means to be a human being. Um, but in terms of the cultural forums, like for better or worse, American culture has played such a pivotal role in creating world culture um, for our time. And I think like Trump knows that America is a brand, and he's going to play that hand as well as it could be played. But like, can America, what I wonder is if America can sacrifice itself if we want to really be a Christian nation, we need to sacrifice ourselves for the good of the world, which is to say, like, uh, to really live up to our ideals and to not act out of fear. I feel like our collective motivation post World War II has been a fear response. Like we're afraid to lose power, and so we we do Korea, we do Vietnam, uh, we do Iraq, we do Afghanistan, and like we try to uh, violently impose freedom on foreign peoples. Bizarre idea. Instead of like creating the example for others to follow, we tried to impose our ideals on others. And I don't know what MAGA, what the next 4 years are going to look like, really. I think Trump is a lot of hot air, and a lot of the things he says are really just to provoke um, the Democratic Party and liberals, and whether he's actually a fascist, I think we have some reason to be concerned about, but I'm also not sure. Uh, so yeah, it's a very pivotal moment. We're right at the edge of that fulcrum, and we could fall in either direction. But I'm not I'm not purely negative about the direction that this country is heading right now. I feel like there is actually an opportunity for something new and fresh, but whether we can seize that moment remains to be seen. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think that talking about Trump here at the end is actually probably the best way to end this, because that is the new year that we're going to be ushering in, and it is probably good to really think about what that entails here. I don't think Trump is a fascist. I think in order to be a fascist, you need to be an ideologue. You need to have an ideology. You have to believe in some kind of ultimate higher ideal. And that's the thing about Trump, and that's why people love him, and that's why he's so dangerous as an American president. He's not an ideologue. He doesn't believe in anything. Um, and this is unfortunately the thing that people love about him is that he's not an ideologue. The fact that he seems down to earth, that he seems concerned with practical things that seem to matter in just the basic sense of like, okay, what puts food on people's tables, what keeps families safe, what keeps us out of wars. I mean, it's not hard at all to see why an American people would look to that and be like, yes, that is a perfectly acceptable alternative to the neoliberal thing that has just been tearing our society to pieces. And that really is one of the morals of the story here, is that post-war neoliberal paradigm is done. It's over. It's not coming back. And everything about the past 70 years has been conditioned by that. It's been conditioned by this view of liberal capitalism as the end of history, this idea of America as this international police state, and fascism as the ultimate boogeyman. The fact that that was the only weapon that the Democrats could bring to bear against Trump, is calling him a fascist over and over again, is very ironic, because Trump's rise to fame and power in a lot of ways was entirely because that narrative within which fascism was considered to be this ultimate evil was coming to an end. We live in the age of the internet. I mean, yes, you can point to the gas chambers and whatnot, but you can also point to the bombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, were we really that much better? Right. And then to use just call anyone you don't like Hitler and expect that to work. And so it's not surprising at all to me that Trump won, but he's not an ideologue. He doesn't believe in anything. And so what happens when shit really hits the fan? And we need to have a very concrete sense of mutual destiny and mutual identity. Well, then we're going to need somebody who's an ideologue. We're going to need somebody who actually has a vision. And Trump is not going to be that. Whatever else he is, he's definitely not going to be that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, I mean, um, Trump's ideology is Trump. I mean, there's these clips of him going back to 2016 where he's talking about how he's exploiting these laws that he doesn't think should exist, but as a businessman, he's like, well, of course, like the H-1B visa program. He's like, "Yeah, I have a lot of these people at my property in Mar-a-Lago. Like, of course, I employ these people. They're cheaper. They're more, motivated. Why wouldn't I use that? But it shouldn't exist." And it's so refreshing to people to have a politician who's honest about the way that the system can be exploited and the way that it's rigged. He's like,
mm-hmm.
that's how, people wonder, like, why this is such a paradox at first blush that, like, a billionaire or however rich Trump is. I mean, maybe he doesn't actually, he has rich friends who are helping him, but, uh, a very, really rich guy somehow becomes the mouthpiece for this populist revolution of working class frustration. It's like, what is going on here? Um, but at the same time, Trump is so honest about the way that he exploits the system that it speaks to people who are resentful at that system and want to fuck that system too. So he's
Mm-hmm.
just voting for Trump is lobbing a grenade into that um, establishment system, and we've reached the point where almost everybody would rather push the blow it all up button. Uh,
Yeah.
and we need that jubilee. We need that release valve. It's just obvious that things have reached such a pressure point that it needs to explode. But I think, again, to speak to the importance of not intellectualism, but the intellect and maintaining a sense of a scientific attitude here, like um, populist movements are important, and I share the resentment towards elites and this form of the imposition of abstract knowledge. Um, that like that all needs to be resisted, but I also feel like we don't want to throw the baby out, which is to say, I don't know, the best example that comes to mind is, and I've had people um, get mad at me for this recently, but like Luigi Mangione and this whole, murdering CEOs thing. Um, it's like, yeah, the personal is political, the political is personal, but like, I feel like once we start to condone that type of thing, things go off the rails really fast, and we might regret it. Um, I prefer a sort of ethics where, you know, we're able to universalize enough and reflect on our before we act enough to realize that like in this particular case, the individuals involved, Luigi and Brian Johnson was it, the CEO, Luigi didn't have an insurance policy with this company. He was actually very wealthy, um, wasn't directly harmed. Now, the other question would be whether Brian was directly harming other people, and maybe Luigi just felt so bad for those people that he sacrificed himself to get revenge on their behalf or something. But I don't know. I feel like if we allow our ethics and our sense of justice and moral reckoning to function in a way that individuals get lost in the system. In other words, Brian Johnson is the CEO of this company who's fiscally, legally responsible to shareholders to make a profit. That like, therefore, he becomes personally responsible for the denials to individuals who don't get, care for whatever their ailment is. I think on the one hand, it's like I wish Brian considered that before he raked in millions to make those kind of decisions as the CEO of this company. But at the same time, this
If
is
he
a
didn't,
lot.
then somebody else would have.
Somebody
Yes,
else,
somebody was going
exactly,
to fill those shoes. Yeah.
exactly. And so there's this wider systemic issue, and like I feel like it's the same mechanistic reduction of morality functioning, whether you're the
Hmm.
CEO of these companies or whether you're the person saying Luigi is justified in murdering this person. You're because like that individual is a victim of the system, whether they're the CEO or they're the person being denied of care. Like, and I know I like classism is a thing, and the way that money flows in our society is extremely unjust. And I'm outraged about that. And I feel like maybe politics isn't enough to deal with that question. Maybe we do need civil disobedience. But there are many levels of civil disobedience below murder that I think might be more effective. Like destroy property, disrupt, everyday routines and like do all of that stuff. Murder's different. Shooting someone in the back in front of their hotel in the middle of the night is different, you know? And so I feel like, yeah, what I'm trying to say here is like, again, these values of individual freedom and social justice, they matter so much that um, if we're going to move forward as a species, like we can't just succumb to vigilantism, um, as if this is some kind of Batman Marvel Comics movie, because it doesn't work out. Like there aren't actually superheroes. We're just people. And if we don't have a justice, allegiance to a sense of justice and abstract, um, a sense of the intellect as a universalizing impulse, that we can think beyond just our own instinctual urges to seek revenge. If we don't have any access to that, we can't get stuck there. We have to include that and transcend that. But if we don't include that, we're fucked.
Yep. If you play the violence game, as satisfying as a violent power fantasy or revenge fantasy may be, Ahriman always wins when you play that game. It wins in terms of the fact that it has heat-seeking missiles and we don't, but also because it is able to control public perceptions in a way that even the things that seem to be so directly against it can be just subsumed into it, and this almost like it's this giant amoeba that can just eat things. I mean, think about all the different like counterculture movements that have proven to be just nothing more but vapid, ineffectual nonsense. Like even the hippie movement and the punk rock movement and everything else. Even the anarchists up on the the west coast trying to do their little independent state in the middle of was it Portland or Seattle, whatever. Regardless, I mean, if you example after example, and these weren't even necessarily violent. The machine is really good at taking like things like that and just first of all just not being harmed by it at all, but then just taking it in, just subsuming it, and it took the hippie movement, processed it a little bit, and put it in a nice little plastic package and put it on a shelf for you to buy, right? And it's going to do that with everything when we're not smart about this, and when we just think that being rebellious is good enough. It's not. And certainly with something like that, with just shooting someone in the back of the head, it might not be obvious now, but I guarantee that will be turned around and used against us somehow. It might look like this tiny victory and we all get to cheer and be like, oh, screw that healthcare CEO, but it'll bite us. It will. It always does. We have to be smarter than that. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to destroy uh, a sense of due process.
Yeah.
And our justice system is broken, no doubt about it, but it's better than mob rule.
Mhm.
And it's so easy to destroy that system. Is very difficult to build it up to the point that it has been established in this country. And in so many other countries, it's like bribes are more mm, normalized. And there's plenty of bribing in this country too, but it's like we've been privileged enough to have a reasonably functional system, and I don't think we should be in such a rush to just toss it out the window, flawed as it is. Um, but yeah, um,
Yeah, I guess we should
good.
wrap this up. I'm all out of steam. So
Likewise, but this has been fun, Keelan. I
oh yeah,
appreciate
totally.
the opportunity to chat with you, and we've had like 100 people watching us for the last couple hours, and hopefully we've stirred the pot, made some sense, and
I feel like the comment section on this is going to be very lively for sure. Like not just the live chat, but once the video goes up, I feel like this is going to get a lot of conversation going because we've jumped through a lot of different topics and said a whole lot of things that people are definitely going to have opinions on. So I
oh
feel like quite
yeah,
a few people are going to see this more than just the ones who have happened to be here for the live stream. So
absolutely. Yeah, I was hoping to get in trouble with you tonight, so we'll see if we succeeded.
hey, it's me. That's just how it goes. All right. Well, anyway, yeah, take it easy, dude. I'll how do I end the recording? I don't know how to do it. I'm just gonna